If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What are your true, strangest, and scariest paranormal encounter stories that creep you out to this day? I've been really scared to speak on this issue because I felt as if nobody would believe me. People throughout the years I have told about this paranormal experience always say that I could have been dreaming or something, but this felt so real, I'm not sure it could have been. I was lying in bed after grabbing a glass of water from upstairs, as I live in my basement, and after watching a show, I fell quickly to sleep. Suddenly, I felt what seemed to be a vacuum sucking, which seemed weird since I didn't hear one go off. I slowly began to open my eyes, still half dazed and sleepy, when suddenly my sheets flew off my bed and I started getting sucked on by an unknown force. By this point, it felt too strong to pull away from, and I was struggling to move. I was too horrified to scream or cry out in fear. Has this ever happened to anyone else? Because when I called the police about this, they said there was no forced entry into my house. People seem to think I'm crazy, and I don't know what to do. I was also in my house alone that night, so it couldn't be dismissed. This was about 6 years ago. I was lying in bed, wide awake, around 9:30 or 10 p.m., when I saw what looked like my sister walk into the middle of my room. My room light was off, and the hallway light was open, so her face was completely blacked out, and I couldn't see it. She stood in what looked like the exact center of the room, facing the wall to the left of me, and stayed perfectly still for what seemed like 25 to 30 seconds before fading into thin air. The fade took about 1 or 2 seconds. What was really odd about it was that I didn't feel scared. It almost felt like curiosity while I was staring at her, like she didn't know I was there. It kind of felt like watching a movie, almost. For additional context, I was living with my mom and sisters at the time, as I was still in school, and her room was a couple doors down from mine. She never had a reason to go into my room, and that still wouldn't explain the fading. Also, I'm pretty sure she was holding a stuffed animal by her side, which is out of character for her as she was around 12 or 13 at the time and didn't sleep with stuffed animals. I used to work as a guard in an office building years ago. The building had 6 floors and was right across the way from a car dealership. My nighttime closing routine was to check each floor and the roof, then set the alarm and go home. Oftentimes, I'd prop the roof door open and have a smoke before taking off for the night. It was usually a nice, cool temperature with a light breeze, so it was a great way to relax and unwind. I remember a string of peculiar nights on the job. It was an oddly starless night, at least, as odd as starless can be when you're near a megawatt bright car lot casting humongous light pollution. I was in the lobby, starting my sweep, when I saw something across the street in the parking lot. It was just out of the corner of my eye, but I could swear I saw someone running, something skittering between the cars. I gazed out there for a long time, trying to see if anything was actually there. After a minute or so, I shrugged it off and continued with my sweep. Still a little rattled, I had my smoke on the roof to calm my nerves. Gazing off toward the horizon, I caught a glimpse of the same motion down in the car lot across the street. I looked down and saw what seemed to be a person, but it was all wrong. It was poised on all fours like the girls from Mama on the hood of a Ford Focus, looking up at me. Its entire body was like an outline, just black with only piercing, white, glowing eyes. I only saw it a moment before it flopped sideways off the hood and scrambled under the car. Needless to say, I hightailed my ass out into my car, speeding home as fast as I could. But the next shift was the real kicker. I'd had about 3 days off and plenty of alcohol and video games to suppress that experience when I went back to work. Everything was going on as normal when it came time for my sweep of the place. Walking across the lobby, I again saw skittering. But this time more. I whipped my head over and saw several of the black figures in the lot momentarily before they ran to hide again. Nearly shitting myself, I rapidly ran through each floor, dying to go home. My roof check came, and as I burst out onto the roof from the door, I saw even more of the things from across the street, but a few were crouched near my Pontiac in the office building parking lot. And this time, none of them looked away or ran. I spent the rest of the night in the guard shack and quit my job in the morning. I want to start this off by saying I don't really believe in paranormal things, but I'm not close-minded either. This happened around October of 2013. I used to work at an old movie theater that opened sometime around 1945, and it's still a running movie theater. Closing up at night by yourself was always a little creepy. The lighting in the auditorium makes you think that you see things out of the corners of your eyes all the time. One night I was closing up, and one of the last things I would do was go upstairs to turn off the auditorium lights before leaving. After turning them off and going back downstairs, I realized I left my jacket at the top of the stairs. On my way back up the stairs, I started whistling. When I got to the top of the stairs, I grabbed my jacket, stopped whistling, and I heard a woman's voice say, "Please stop whistling." I never left work so fast. I was pretty scared to be there by myself for a few months after that. I came home from a long day being out of my apartment, went into my bedroom, turned on the lights, and saw a very clear human handprint in the condensation on the inside of my window. Humid air, cold weather. I was kind of creeped out. I asked my roommates if they'd gone in my room or let maintenance workers through. They said they hadn't. I wiped down the whole window with a towel and put it out of my mind. I went to sleep in my bed with my girlfriend at the time. I should mention I always kept my blinds pulled up to the ceiling because my cat likes to bat at them and break them trying to sit in the window, and that was true that night. Consequently, I woke up to the sun streaming in through my window. I went to put my blinds down to block the sun and checked the window as I did this, since I was still a little freaked out. There were no handprints and a solid coat of condensation all over the window. My girlfriend and I stayed in bed for about an hour and were the only ones in my room. I went back to pull the blinds up because my cat was meowing at the door to get into my bedroom. When I pulled the blinds up, there was another handprint in a different section of the window. I screamed a little bit, and it definitely freaked us all out. Weird stuff continued to happen in that apartment. My aunt and mom were teaching at Crow Point 40 or so years ago. This was before my mom even met my dad. She and my aunt were coincidentally placed there together. My aunt introduced my mom and dad. They were driving home. Random weeknight. 2-lane highway, cruising about 70 or so. My aunt looms over, and a guy is keeping pace with them, running in the ditch along the highway. My aunt was so scared that she didn't say anything to my mom. They slowed down to turn, and the guy went into the middle of the highway and disappeared. My mom and aunt didn't actually talk about it until the morning. But both of their stories were exactly the same, even 35 years later. I have some really good friends who live up in the Farmington and Bloomfield areas. They will straight up stand up and walk out of a room as soon as someone mentions a skinwalker. When I was little, there were these stairs in my house. It was a normal staircase with hand railings. Nothing creepy. But for some reason, whenever I went up those stairs, I felt the need to run. As if something were behind me. By the time I got to my room, my heart would be racing. I'd be out of breath. I never knew why. I assumed it was because when the lights were out, it was hard to see the bottom stairs as the darkness covered them. A couple of years later, my sister told me she had seen a man standing at the bottom of those steps. She described him as a ghost. At this point, I still hadn't put two and two together. A while later, I mentioned something about those stairs and how, allegedly, they're haunted. My brother's face turned stone cold when I mentioned it. It turned out that he had also seen a man on the steps. I remembered that feeling of terror as I raced up the steps. It all clicked for me. Now, when I go up the steps, I can feel it. It's a shiver down my spine. A terror behind me. And every time I turn my back on that wall and run up the steps, I still feel it. I don't know if this was paranormal. I tend to think that it was because there's no explanation for it that I can think of, but anyway, here it goes. By the way, I never told this to anyone because I thought people would think that we were insane. I still think that you guys probably still will. But it's something extra weird, and it should be told. So be it. This was in the late 2000s, I don't remember exactly the year, and it happened to my then wife and myself in our home. It was winter time in southern Massachusetts, a cloudy night but no storms, and it was around 11:30 at night. We were in our living room, just watching some movies. I was relaxing on an easy chair, lazy boy style, and my wife was sitting on a small couch, about 6 feet from me. There was no noise but the movie going on, and all of a sudden there was a flash. Everything went all white for a tiny fraction of a second, like all you could see was just the color white, and when that was over, really quickly, as you may imagine, something was very different. You see, that room was a really huge addition that the house's previous owners had done, I guess sometimes in the 90s. They built that and a sizable deck outside it. The room was very large and had cathedral ceilings, which at its top must have easily reached 15 feet, this is a guess, I don't know for sure. It looked like it would go up forever. On the ceiling, there were a bunch of small lights and a skylight. Being nighttime, the skylight looked like a black square, and the lights were providing great illumination. Courtesy of a dimmer, the lights were just right, not too strong, not too weak. Well, right after that flash had gone, I looked up at the ceiling, and what I saw froze me in place. Gone were the lights, gone was the square skylight that was dark because it was night. Starting from about 7 feet up from the floor, yes, had we stood up, We could have feasibly touched it. There was what looked like an inverted, as in upside down, pool of what looked like, for the lack of better words, milk. But it had a strange glow to itself. I watched fascinated as this white stuff rippled gently, with small waves, like it really was a thick liquid. My mind was horrified and curious at the same time because I couldn't find any phenomenon that could have caused what I was seeing, a pool of glowing milk lazily rippling, suspended above our heads. I immediately thought that I must have imagined that, and to get confirmation that I wasn't having some medical emergency that made me see things, I looked at my wife, who was on the couch. She was staring up at the same thing with her mouth open. All of a sudden, in another flash and in a blink of an eye, that pool of white stuff wasn't there any longer. It had lasted maybe 10 seconds, and everything had gone back to normal. My wife turned to look at me wild-eyed, and I said, "Did you just see that?" And she said, "Yes." I asked her what she thought it was, and she said she had no idea. I dabbled with the idea that this was some odd lightning thing, but there wasn't any storm, and I am not aware of any natural phenomenon with these characteristics. Nothing was damaged. In that room there were pretty high-end electronics, and what we saw looked damn solid. As I said, the consistency and look of regular milk. I remember thinking that the ripples or little waves I was seeing in that stuff were something that, had they hit your body, you'd have really felt them. It felt like whatever this was, it had substance. In any case, this really spooked me big time. I bought my house in 2016. 9 months later, it burned down. No one was hurt, but the house was a complete loss. I rebuilt it with just a few modifications. I didn't think much of it. Just one of those life things that stink. After we moved back in, strange things began to happen. Flickering lights was one of the first things. But it has just gotten stranger. One day, my husband and I woke up, and there were claw marks in the sheets between us. I started getting scratches on my back. My husband does not have long fingernails, and neither do I, plus, some were in areas I couldn't reach easily. I got strange circular contusions on my stomach. The dermatologist could find nothing wrong and suggested I scratch myself in perfect circles that looked like cigarette burns. Several times, there have been strange puddles of water in the kitchen. Once, the water was actually dripping from the ceiling beams. There are no pipes in the ceiling. I asked my daughter if she had spilled anything. She hadn't. Due to the wooden interior, the ceiling and the bedroom floor are made of the same wood. My husband had a large bait tank in the basement. One weekend, we went out of town. When we came home, all the water was gone, and the fish were dead. There was no water or wetness in the basement. We are talking about 100 gallons that are just gone. My husband got the dead fish out, threw them in the woods, and then cleaned the tank. The next day, there were about 20 fish in the tank. One day, he fell asleep in his chair with his iPad on his lap. He woke up when the iPad hit him in the head and fell back into his lap. Several times, the house has started creaking very loudly. This creaking can go on for 20 to 30 minutes. I guess it could be settling creaking, but I've never experienced this kind of creaking in any other house or for this duration. I've seriously thought the house was going to collapse on me. One day, my husband was working in his shop in the basement. He heard some people talking loudly upstairs and thought my daughter was home with a friend. He came up a few minutes later, and no one was here. When asked later, my daughter had not been home all day. Then there is my daughter's dog, who just stares into the corner from time to time. I'm not sure what to do. I've saged and salted. It seems to do some good for a while, but the strange occurrences always come back. We love this house, but we want to rid ourselves of these events if at all possible. Any suggestions are appreciated. I live in Arizona. I was in Ohio for some time and had to drive back. I drove all the way from Ohio to Arizona, covering around 2,000 miles the whole way. And pretty much every state was beautiful, the people were nice, the food was good, etc. I get to Amarillo, Texas, and sleep till about 11 p.m. at night to finish the trip off to Arizona. But this means driving pretty much all the way through New Mexico. No big deal, right? So far, the trip has been awesome. There is no reason to believe New Mexico can be this weird place. Dude, I was so wrong. Getting into New Mexico wasn't bad, and I stopped off at a favorite gas station to pick up some cigarettes and food. Know how all throughout the night most loves are pretty full? Not this one. And it was only like 12 p.m. ghost town, basically. I didn't think much of it and kept going. I'm driving along, and I hear a couple raindrops. I had checked the weather before, there shouldn't be a drop of rain anywhere near me. Sure, as soon as I'm finishing this thought, it starts pouring rain. And I don't mean normal pour. I mean, pull over now, or we're going into a ditch at 65 miles per hour. I waited about 20 minutes, and it cleared up. By the way, what the duck happened to all the semis? I should pretty much always see one out here. They were gone. I continued on into ghost town after ghost town. What stinks is that my car is electric, so I have to stop to charge quite a bit. I dreaded stopping in New Mexico. I always felt watched. These strange, large dogs would walk in the distance. Not going away, but not attacking you either. Just checking you out in the craziest way, dude. I usually would nap while it charged, but duck that. I constantly saw weird lights in the distance. Etc. Finally, it's about 3 to 4 a.m. and I'm driving down this never-ending road, and this car, which I had never seen before, is magically behind me. Look down at the radio and look back up. Lights in my face. That's fast, bro. I seriously hate talking about it. He followed me for 2 hours, then just went about his day. The rest of New Mexico was pretty uneventful as the sun came up, and the closer I got to Arizona, the more people I saw. But Jesus Christ was creepy in that place. Let me preface this by saying my grandma is one of the most level-headed people I have ever met. When it comes to paranormal stuff, she has always been a critic and skeptic. This is also a throwaway account because, up until last night, I never thought I would share this sort of stuff. I was raised by my grandma. My mother was not in my life, so she is the mother figure in my life. I was hanging out with her because we went to the store to get stuff for my classroom. I'm a teacher, and she likes to help out and buy things for me. She is not a scary movie fan, but she likes Stephen King, so I told her I was going to see the second IT movie in the theater because I saw the first one last year. We talked about random stuff for a bit, and I told her about how the woods my aunt used to take our dog for a walk in are one of the most haunted places in the area. I asked her if she ever saw a ghost, and this is what she told me. Back in the 1960s, the Michigan State Fair was a big deal. She would go with her friends. One night they were heading back to the car, and a couple of kids approached them and asked for a ride. There was a girl a bit younger than them and a boy much younger than her. She said they both had black hair, and they were pale. She and her friend were freaked out by them. She said they both have an ominous feeling, normally something she would not feel around two kids. She said the girl said something weird along the lines of, "Can you give us a ride to the city my grandma lived in, since you are headed there?" Which was strange because how would they know the name of the city or where my grandma lived? My grandma said they were not headed that way, they had to stop by a friend first anyway. The girl said that it did not matter, they would wait in the car. My grandma continued on and said that they were most likely spending the night with their friends because they were headed to the fair the next day as well. She said she could sense the girl was getting mad. They said sorry and walked really fast to the car. My grandma said she looked back at them, and she could see the girl's eyes were black and lifeless, even though there was a street light nearby. She said when you drove out of this parking lot, you had to drive by where the girl and her brother would have been, but when they drove by, there was no one around. Based on the time it took to leave this area, you would have at least seen them walking away down to the fairgrounds. My grandma is convinced that these were ghosts, but I was freaked out, thinking they could have been black-eyed kids. Up until this point, I believed in them as much as I did Slender Man or anything else I thought was made up. I asked her if they said anything strange, like their sentence structure, but she said no, they were just like kids. They wore clothes like kids their age wore, but she said it almost felt like they were void of color, but she does not know why she thinks that. Now that my grandma is only in her early 70s, she is all there in the head, and I don't think there would be any reason for her to make this up. She is also not an internet person, except for old lady video games, so I know she has no idea what a Beck is. I had to share this because I'm so weirded out. So just a few days ago, when I woke up in the morning, I found some strange and creepy things from the night before. I've decided to tell the story here. So about 4 days ago, I woke up just like any other day, and I was sure I had a full night's sleep. I went to bed at 10 p.m. However, I noticed straight away that my chair in my room was placed right next to my bed, facing me. But the night before, the chair was tucked in next to my computer. This immediately freaked me out, and I never remember waking up or why I would move my chair in such a way. What creeped me out even more was that I checked my phone, and on photos, I noticed 4 new photos had been taken. Looking at the date, they were all taken around 2:45 a.m. last night. However, the photos were completely black, and in them I could slightly see some details of my room. I was really creeped out. I don't remember even touching my chair, let alone my phone, in the middle of the night, and if I did, why would I take random dark photos? This has really freaked me out. I tried increasing the contrast on the photos, but nothing, it's just a really dark picture with some of my furniture you can hardly make out. Anyone have an explanation for this? Is it paranormal? Did some creep break into my place and watch me sleep? Or was it something else? If anyone has any ideas, I'd really appreciate it because it's pretty much haunted me out to go to sleep since. My great-uncle's house in the northern suburbs is absolutely haunted. It's more than 100 years old and was built by my great-great-grandfather when they moved to the area, back when the place was scrubland. I won't say where exactly it is because it very obviously stands out in the suburb, being a house made of wood amongst a bunch of brick homes. The council has been after him for years to sell it because it's on a big block, but as long as he keeps it maintained and habitable, he can't be forced. Almost every member on that side of the family has died in that home up until very recently. Great-grandfather, great-grandmother, grandmother and grandfather, aunts and uncles. In the 30s or 40s, the family was afflicted with stuff like polio and tuberculosis, and they lost a couple of kids to that in the house too. I visit the place frequently and have stayed there overnight on about a dozen occasions, and it is 100% haunted as FCK. Stuff like seeing shadows walking through doorways in the hall out of the corner of your eye, stuff disappearing and reappearing in other rooms, hearing conversations that you can't make out in other rooms that stop when you go in there, footsteps at all hours, radios playing from rooms that you don't have a radio in, etc. I'm personally not much of a believer myself. I think if there is something beyond death, then it's pretty separate from our own reality, and most ghost stories can be chalked up to pipes emitting that spooky frequency noise or overexposure on cameras, etc. But that house. My parents and I were coming back from a trip to Mexico some years ago when they saw a levitating person. We used to drive to and from our trips to Mexico, so we left that morning at around 4:30 or 5-ish. Anyway, there is a lot of desert around the part of Mexico where we go. It is very hilly too. But there are these small towns in between that we have to go through to get to the main roads. We were probably 20 minutes into our trip when I felt the car slowing down. I don't make too much of it since there are a lot of huge speed bumps around those parts. I was in the back seat playing on a DS when I looked up. My parents were both looking in an alleyway, trying to see something. I asked what it was they were looking for, and they described it as a person wearing a white robe. They said it was kind of like that thing E.T. was wearing at the beginning of the movie. Apparently they had seen this person come down from floating in the air, they said. When she touched the ground, my parents said she jetted into this alley that was dimly lit and in view from the speed bump we were at. I saw the alley, and no one was there. There were no doors in this alley, no ladders, nothing. There's no way she could have run the whole thing. She just kind of vanished. There is a strong belief in witches down in Mexico, and my parents are both convinced that they saw a witch that morning. They're both from Mexico and have both run into paranormal stuff there, including witches. To this day, you can still see the awe in their faces whenever they talk about it. I feel I should preface this story with the statement that I am usually a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stories, albeit an open-minded one. I had never had an experience I would truly say was paranormal until this one. I have searched for hours on Google, attempting to find a similar story from someone else, and have had no luck. What really stands out for me is that there is an energy or feeling that accompanies the experience, and even remembering it still gives me this feeling and goosebumps. This is not something I normally experience, and most people who know me would probably be surprised that I would be spooked by much of anything. I am a veteran, and I have spent years since leaving the military working in emergency rooms, specialized security, and doing other high adrenaline jobs. I am not prone to being creeped out. I am hoping to find someone else who may have had a similar experience, as I feel oddly compelled to relate to someone about this. With that, here goes. A couple of months ago, I was driving with my wife down a rural highway in Oregon, returning home from a road trip to Crater Lake. We live on the coast, and the highway we were taking to get back is very curvy as it winds through the Cascade Mountain Range. It was dark as ink and probably about 11 p.m. we were driving along, and I was watching the road, going about 45 miles per hour. We round a bend, which makes me slow down to about 45, and just as we get around it, my wife suddenly says, "Look out, there's a person there." It takes me a second for some reason as I let off the gas, then I notice her, him, or it. Crouched near the side of this two-lane highway, on my left side, is a person wearing what looks like gray baggy sweats or clothes and a reflective vest. This is an easy 20 miles either direction from civilization and is heavily wooded, think Oregon coast forest. I begin braking, and instantly the figure stands up, faces us, and begins jogging directly at the car. It felt like electricity in the air, as when she faced us, her head was flopped to the side, like her neck was totally limp, and her mouth was wide open. She appeared to have gray hair, and her arms and hands were held up to her chest, her wrists curled. Her legs didn't seem to be working right either, as she hobbled at us, thinking like severe, progressing then it hit, this primal-like feeling of dread, like my subconscious knew something wasn't right. I couldn't fully focus on her as the car was still moving and I had to steer. But my wife was looking right at her. My first thought normally would have been to hit the brakes and see what was going on, as once again, this is literally miles and miles from town, but there was just this dread feeling in the air, and time almost seemed to slow down. At that moment, I hear my wife say, "Don't stop, just go." Instinctively, I accelerated. As we sped up, this lady was jogging right at us and must have come within a foot of running into the side of our car as we went past her. We rounded the next bend, and I looked at my wife and just said, "What the hell was that? I should turn around. Who the hell jogs out here? What was wrong with her neck?" My wife just looks at me and says, "No. Don't go back." I don't know what that was. I told her I couldn't look directly at her for long as I was focused on the road, but she described what I saw, and she confirmed she saw the same. She said when she came up to the side of the car, she was staring right at us, and my wife looked her in the eyes, but she didn't have any pupils, and her expression stayed just like frozen, mouth open. We scoured news stories, and I even contacted authorities. They advised no one was reported missing or hurt out there. I still get this strange, intense, electrified feeling anytime I think about her, as does my wife. Anytime I talk about her, I am compelled to refer to the person as such. All I know is that it wasn't right. We have now coined her the floppy-headed jogger. Has anyone else experienced something like this? I've had many strange encounters with things I can't explain. I hardly talk about them, since, like many who believe in this stuff, I don't want to be labeled negatively. The typical disclaimer: I tend to rationalize and am skeptical of paranormal events. Usually, there is a perfectly normal explanation for things. However, I've experienced enough of the unknown, both by myself and with others present, that I feel I just can't brush it aside. Anyway, this particular incident came to mind today. I was 7 years old. My mom was in the backyard. It was the weekend, early afternoon, and I'd been up for a few hours. I'm in the living room, sitting on the floor with some toys, when I hear my dad calling for me from upstairs. "Twildy, come up here." So without a second thought, I run upstairs to see what he wants. To me, it sounded like his voice was coming from the bathroom, which was just a few feet from the top of the stairs. I see the door open, and no one is in there. I call for him, no response. I check mine, my brother's bedroom, we shared one, and my parents' bedroom. No one was in either of them. Thinking that odd, I go back downstairs to find my mom, who is now in the kitchen. I ask her, "Where's Dad?" She tells me he's at work, and he won't be home until much later in the evening. This is the only time I've ever had an experience with something that's mimicked the voice of someone I know, clear as day. Years later, when I was 21, my mom had an experience with a mimic in a different home, thinking she was having a conversation with my stepdad while she was in the shower. I was downstairs on the other side of the house with my stepdad the whole time, and neither of us were talking. We were watching a movie. Has anyone else had experience with a mimic? I'd be curious to hear stories. I was home alone, and I went into the garden to dry the laundry. Halfway through, my back ached for no reason. It just happened suddenly, and I felt like someone was watching me. I looked up at all the windows of the house, and peering out the bathroom window was a woman with light brown hair and slightly crumpled clothes, but seemingly normal looking. I freaked out and ran inside to confront her, but when I got to the bathroom, it was locked from the inside. I pounded on the door for a few seconds before it opened, and the window was wide open. There was no way she would have been able to escape out of the window. The first floor is quite high up, and she didn't pass me to get downstairs. She didn't appear on the CCTV around the outside of the house either. I have never been more scared in my life. I lived in a sickly red 2-story home in the middle of Indiana. Since they have repainted, I may be able to say it was in a safe farmer-run town named Michigan Town. I lived on the second story, my parents lived on the first, and my weird uncle and his girlfriend lived on the top story. I was an overly creative night owl, 7 years old. Every night I would play pretend on my bed. I had a giant bedroom with only my bed in it. I was a dumb, naive dipshit, and multiple scary things happened frequently. One night I was up playing when I heard a slow, stretched out creak. I looked over, and now that I think about it, I should have said something. I saw a weird, elongated rake-ass can moving from the door. I thought nothing of it. I was lying down at night in that half-awakened state and heard a scream. My door was wide open, and I saw a shine similar to that of a cat's eyes in a photo 4 to 5 feet off the ground. I scrambled and saw it bound away, taking off to see it more often than not. The last one I am willing to say is not by me, but by my sister. She was going down the hardwood stairs when she was pushed down the stairs. My parents looked at her and saw giant gashes down her back. We moved 7 houses down next month. I hope these stories taught you that the supernatural does exist. When I was younger, I lived on the countryside of East Oklahoma with my mother and grandmother. From where we lived, it wasn't unusual to see nothing but dirt roads for 10 miles around. During the fall in the evening, I was out in the woods exploring the many hills around my house. Being a curious kid and all, I walked about a mile or so away from home until I came across an old red house sitting at the bottom of the hill. There was an old white truck sitting in the driveway with what I remember looking like a burned pit not far away in the back. I was afraid of confrontation when I was younger, and it was going to get dark, so I decided I was going to backtrack and just head back home. But just as I was walking away, I heard someone call, "Hey!" It was a woman's voice, and I knew it was coming from the direction of the house. The thing is, there was no one outside and no one in the windows either, not that I could see anyway. I didn't know if the voice was calling for me specifically, so I stood there and waited to see someone. No one showed, so I began walking away but kept my eyes on the house. Just as it was disappearing from my view, I saw an older woman with black hair and a brown and red dress come outside from the front door. She looked up at me and smiled, then pointed her finger directly at me. I didn't want to engage, so I acted like I didn't see her and continued on. I kept walking until my house came back into view, then started down the small hill, all while thinking about what dinner would be. That's when I heard the same "hey" from before. It honestly sent a chill down my back. I thought the old woman had followed me all the way back home. I whipped around and scanned the trees, trying my best to spot someone. Instead, I only saw a large owl sitting in a tree about 10 feet off the ground. It didn't hoot or make any noise, it just stared directly at me, almost intently. In my culture, owls are bad omens, and typically, when you hear them, it means someone you know is going to die. So much anxiety filled me after seeing this owl and hearing the woman's voice. I wasn't going to stick around in the woods any longer, so I began walking more hurriedly. "Where are you going?" I heard the voice call from the woods behind me. I wanted to run so badly. Something in me kept telling me not to run, do not show you are afraid. In my head, I kept thinking it was the owl. The owl is talking to me, this isn't an owl. I go inside to see my grandmother, who is in the kitchen reading a magazine. I tell her, "Gram, there was an owl outside. I think it was talking to me." I knew she could tell I was afraid, her eyes looked like she knew something I didn't. "Where were you, and where is it now?" she asked, standing up and pulling the curtains closed. I was walking in the woods, and I saw a red house and an old lady. I pointed in the direction of where I went. "The owl is there, I'm scared, Gram." She followed my finger, then walked into the other room to get my mom. "It's her, I know it is Amber. She's been coming more and more," my grandmother whispered angrily. My mother came over to me and said, "Baby, show me where the owl is." My mother smiled, but I could tell she was angry, perhaps even scared. She took my hand and led me out the door. I didn't want to go back outside, but I trusted my mother, so I went. "It was over there," I told her. She led me by the hand and gripped it tight. "Don't be afraid, Colty," she said. "Is that it?" At first, I didn't see what she was pointing at because, at this time, it was getting dark, but then I spotted it. The same huge owl. "That's it," I whispered, afraid it would hear me. My mother bent down and picked up a rock the size of a lemon. "Witch, stay away from my son." My mother chunked the rock hard. The owl, beginning to take off, got clipped in the wing by the rock, and I swear it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever heard. It made a screeching noise like a pig, then trailed off into what sounded exactly like a woman screaming. It flew off into the dark woods, and without another word, my mom took my hand again and led me back into the house. That night I heard bits and pieces of my mom's conversation with my grandmother, stuff like, "She's evil, she killed her husband. And she's a stakini, she was following my grandbaby." And the final part I heard made me terrified of the woods, "She eats hearts." The next day, my mother told me we were going to town but had to stop somewhere really quick to check something. So we load up into our small car and drive down the dirt road for a bit, and we come up to a familiar sight. It was the red house. I thought, this is that old lady's house. I wonder why we are here. Then I began to scan the woods around us, looking for that owl, not as afraid since it was daytime. My mother knocked on the door and waited for a minute before the same old woman came outside. The old woman wasn't smiling. Instead, she looked at my mother like she hated her, and then I saw her turn to me with those piercing eyes. I couldn't hear what my mom was saying, but while I tried to listen, my eyes looked down at something that wasn't there yesterday. The old woman's arm was wrapped up in a bandage and a makeshift sling. It was then that it all clicked. She was the owl. It was her voice calling to me. I put my face in my hands because I didn't want to see her. To me, this woman was a real-life monster. I heard her slam her door, and my mom was getting back in the car. "Sorry, baby, we'll go now." I looked up as we were driving off and, thankfully, didn't see her. "Mom, was she that owl?" I asked, feeling like I knew the answer fully well. My mother was silent for a bit. "Yes. She was," she said. She was sounding angry again. "That woman is our cousin. We don't ever talk to her." "Then why did you talk to her?" I asked. My mom looked at me for a split second and said, "Because of you." After that, she wouldn't answer any more of my questions regarding her and kept insisting that I drop it before she whoops my butt. Years later, I found out that the old lady's husband had died of a heart attack years prior. Soon after this all happened, she died, and I don't know how, only my grandmother knew, and she's since passed as well. I still think about this sometimes and how my grandmother's words still ring in my ears. The owl lady who was following me that day ate hearts. The day after my 3rd birthday, my grandpa, Dad's grandfather, passed away. I was raised Catholic, and every year after that, I would use one of my birthday balloons and send it to heaven for him. Fast forward to when I was 16, and my dad passed away unexpectedly just a few months before my birthday. I had gone to see a medium to try to get some closure and reassurance that he was okay and still around. Once my birthday came up, I decided that this year, for my 17th birthday, I would send a balloon for my grandpa and dad. I wrote on the front and back of this star balloon, thanking my dad for everything he has done and given me throughout my life and how much I love and miss him. I asked him to still stay near me and not give me my space. The medium said he was trying to give me space as a teenager. A few days after sending these balloons, my then boyfriend and I were sitting in bed having a conversation while my phone was plugged in several feet away and out of reach. Out of nowhere, Siri goes off and says, "I'm here, you're welcome." I do not have Hey Siri activated, and even if I did, it was not in the preset voice or any of the voice options. Stunned and confused, my boyfriend and I spent about a half hour asking Siri questions, trying to get the same response but getting nothing. No matter what we said or asked, it did not say, "I'm here, you're welcome." Personally, I believe in the existence of energies over religion, and this is my proof of my dad's energy still being present and alive, although in another form. Strange happenings at home I can't explain. 2 months ago, I heard a loud groan type noise over my head while watching TV on my couch. It lasted about 4 seconds. I immediately stood up and turned the lights on. I thought maybe it was an animal in the attic, but it sounded like it was right above my head. Since then, I've heard knocking on my front door. I have a camera out there, and it only activates when it detects movement. It never catches the knocking, but it reoccurring. Sometimes it sounds like it's coming from the wall. It's fast and doesn't repeat, but it happens. Things in the house keep moving around. There's even an instance of this on my Instagram where the entire bin of cat treats is in the middle of the kitchen floor. I only noticed they were there because I heard my cat eating them. It perplexed me how they got there. That isn't the only thing moving around. Last night, next to my bed, I put my Gatorade down on my nightstand. When I went to go for it, it was now moved to the floor, a quarter of the way under my bed. This morning, I noticed a cup that had been tucked away in the back of the cabinet since I moved here was now dead center on the kitchen countertop. I have cameras set up in my house in case it's me sleepwalking, but so far I haven't caught anything on camera. I don't know what exactly is happening, but something is happening. Any advice? I'm more worried it's a person than anything supernatural, but there's no evidence of that either. A few friends and I were in South America for a couple months and had decided beforehand to hike the Inca Trail. I'll fast forward to the 3rd night here, as the first couple days and nights were paranormally uneventful. On the 3rd night, our guide tells us the story of the campground where we were staying that night. He told us that for about a decade or two, I can't remember the exact range, but I would venture it was closer to the latter, there used to be a small mining village by the campsite we were staying at. One night, the shining path ripped through the area and massacred the town, executing a bunch of the villagers in the caves around the town. At this point, our guide tells us that if we see any lights in the night or hear anybody calling our name, he said it would sound like our friends or family, telling us to follow them. We should remember to stay put and that the lights and voices were the spirits trying to trick us into getting lost in the jungle. He also told us that he had hikers who had been dragged out of their tents by their feet. I guess it was a sort of revenge against the interlopers sort of thing. That night, my buddy and I were in our tent and, of course, telling each other ghost stories to keep the spooky campfire atmosphere going. We went to bed pretty early as the campsite was pitch black, so I'm not too sure when all the creepy stuff happened, but I think I'd only been asleep a few hours before everything started. Our tents were pretty tiny, 2-man jobs, built for Peruvians, I guess. Not for taller Canadians, so our feet would be against the entrance of the tent at all times. As I was saying, a few hours into the night, the sound started. You know the sound when something brushes against a tent or windbreaker fabric? That sort of zippery sound? That was the first thing that woke me up. And it wasn't a fellow hiker, either. The campsite was set up on a 3-tiered sort of embankment, and there was only a couple feet of space between the tent and the next tier below. I mention this because none of us would be able to traverse it without light, without tripping on pegs, ropes, etc. Soon after the sound started, the touching started. Remember when I said our feet would be touching the tent? Well, something was touching our feet from outside. You could see the tent push in where whatever it was trying to grab at our feet. It was almost a side swipe, grabbing at our feet. You could feel it, even with our feet inside the sleeping bags. Not wanting to look like a couple of pansies, my buddy and I went fetal, tried to laugh it off, and said it was just a wild chicken or deer. Anything else. Finally, because our eyes couldn't stay open any longer, we crashed. I don't know how long after this happened, and I've had experience with sleep paralysis before, and this definitely felt similar but crazy different at the same time. I woke up. My buddy was staring at me from across the tent. There was a soft light in the tent, and I'm not sure where it came from. I couldn't move. At all. My buddy, without breaking eye contact, sat up and told me, "Listen. You need to follow me. You need to come with me right now." And then he reached over towards me as if to unzip my sleeping bag. I couldn't take it. I wrenched my head to the side, willing my body to move. This is what happens in sleep paralysis with me. All of a sudden, the lights go out, and I'm staring at my buddy, who is once again looking straight at me. He told me that I had screamed in my sleep and woken him up, but I couldn't tell if I was where I was, if he was who he was, or if I was even in the real world. I had to get him to prove it was actually him. This entire time, something was pushing our tent in sporadically and rubbing against the outside. Eventually, I was satisfied he was real, and I forced myself to sleep so I could forget the damn sounds and whatever was outside and wake up to sunlight. The next day, a few other hikers said they had issues with things touching their tent. One even said he was positive that the zipper on his tent was moving up slowly. Real or not, it sure freaked me out and made me speed hike to put as much distance between that campsite and me. I was standing with my older brother, both of us smoking cigarettes, outside on my parents' porch. My family and I grew up in a very superstitious part of the American Southwest. I guess you could say that in a part of America where there is a very strong fear of skinwalkers. I know, another skinwalker story, but what I witnessed with my brother felt chillingly real. A few years before this incident, my older brother and I encountered something in our parents' backyard, so we've always been a bit on edge at night, still am to this day. That, and we grew up in a culture that discourages people from wandering around at night without some sort of blessing. But we were a few years older, smoking our cigarettes, catching up because my brother was attending college in the city, and I was finishing up my junior year in high school. I was rambling on about something when I saw my brother focus his attention on our neighbor's yard. I looked over at what he was staring at and found myself looking at a shadow figure standing outside our neighbor's house. And it's hard to describe this shadow as its figure was basically blacker than the night outside, the dim glow of the street lights, having an almost shadowy radiance, if that makes any sense. It was standing on the side of our neighbor's house, and while I couldn't see its face, I knew it was staring at our neighbor's closed windows. My brother and I looked at each other with disbelief. We'd both hear the stories about skinwalkers roaming around at night. I mean, we both witnessed that sort of thing years ago, but it was only a glimpse followed by hearing the most otherworldly, horrifying howl that sounded both human and animal. But this was different. It was like seeing something we were never meant to see. Something even more sinister. We said nothing to each other, turning our gaze back towards the figure, who was still staring at the neighbor's window. After what seemed like a long moment, the figure started to turn and walk to our neighbor's backyard. But the way it moved was a surreal sight. It looked to be moving both slowly and quickly at the same time. Like jogging in place, except it was gliding along. Then it moved towards a group of neighborhood dogs. And I knew these were neighborhood dogs because I recognized almost every one of them under the dim tangerine backyard light, but they weren't scared by the shadow figure. In fact, they looked to be welcoming it. The dogs formed a crowd around the figure, which stopped, and I swear to this day, it morphed down onto all fours, sprang a black tail, and disappeared into the night with the group of neighborhood dogs following. I looked to my brother and asked, "What did you put into these cigarettes?" We both chuckled, but we knew what we saw and hurried back inside, making sure we took our cigarette butts with us. Inside, our dad and youngest brother were asleep, but our mom was still up. We told our mom what happened, and she instructed us to go outside to get some wood to burn. She smeared ash on our foreheads, and we went outside to gather some firewood. While walking towards the woodpile, we noticed that our street light, which was on when we were heading back inside after stamping out our cigarettes, was out, the only street light out in the entire neighborhood. We saw it as a sign of something being around and hurried to gather the woods. Right when we were about to head inside, we could smell it, the strong, putrid scent of a dead animal. We knew right there and then that we were in the middle of all those stories we'd hear about skinwalkers. We didn't stop to take a look around. Instead, we made haste back into our house and built a fire. We told our mom what we smelled outside, and she marched outside with a fresh tin of ash to confront whatever was out there. She yelled in English and her native language, "Leave us the duck alone, we never did anything to you," and commanded for it to leave by the traditional ways and the way of Jesus Christ. She sprinkled ash outside our front and back porches and anchored a bow and arrow above the door leading out towards the back porch. We slept that night without any incidents. Months later, when I moved to the city to live with my older brother and work for the summer, I got a call from our mom. She told me that the neighbor, who lived in the house that the shadow figure was outside of, died of cancer. Whatever we saw that night still chills me to this day. When my dad was in his early teens, his family invited his uncle, his father's brother, to come stay with them while the uncle was looking for a job and until he could find his own place. One day my grandparents sent my dad downstairs to the spare bedroom to make sure his uncle was up in time for his new job, and my dad found him unresponsive, wrapped up in the sheets on the floor next to the bed. It turns out he had a heart attack in the night and died while they were all sleeping. A couple months later, some family from my grandmother's side are visiting and hanging out in the basement, and one of the younger kids, 5 or 6 years old, wanders off by herself into the spare bedroom. Suddenly, she starts screaming bloody murder, so everyone rushes in to see what's wrong. The girl is pointing to the corner of the room where my dad found his uncle screaming, "There's a man! There's a man!" No one else sees anything, and the girls insist for a while that there is a big, bearded man lying on the floor of the room until they look under the bed and in the closet, reassure her there's no one there, and take her out and calm her down. My father's uncle was a big, bearded man. My dad tells this story all the time, to new friends whenever talk turns to the supernatural or unexplained, or just to the family when he gets a few drinks in him. I believe it's true because my dad is so earnest about it, and because I don't think anyone who knew what had happened to my dad's uncle would somehow convince this 6-year-old girl to lie so convincingly about seeing him. When my brother and I were both around 8 to 10 years old, we were sleeping in the same room and both saw the same ghost at the same time. We awoke in the middle of the night to see a ghost standing in our room. It appeared to be a tall native woman in a long white dress with long, straight dark hair. I was just standing next to our dresser at the foot of our beds. I seem to remember her looking at us, or in our direction, but my brother doesn't remember that part, or at least he didn't seem to think she was looking at us directly. But almost all of the other details we both remember are the same. We looked at each other and looked back, and she was gone. But I am 2 years older, so obviously I am correct in my recollection. I was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the time, up in the heights, near the tramway. This was about 30 years ago or so. We both fell asleep afterwards and never really talked about it for another 20 years. I studied abroad in Italy my junior year of college and lived at this old castle. The students stayed in what is affectionately called the croft. Every night we would hear noises, like someone walking, but we would just assume it was the old wood creaking or somebody going to use the restroom. One weekend, the whole group, except me and 2 others, decided to go to Milan for the weekend. Well, one evening, as I lay in bed reading a book and waiting for my friend to get back from the library, I distinctly heard the sound of the croft door open and close. I then heard halting steps on the stairs. These were not subtle creaks but obvious footsteps, so I assumed it was my friend or his girlfriend coming back, so of course I thought nothing of it. Then the steps began to sound closer and closer to my door, but I heard no voices, and an unexpected chill crawled down my spine. I felt nervous, so I yelled, "Is that you, Dave?" The steps stopped outside my door, but again, no one spoke. I was starting to become terrified when I heard my friend and his girlfriend walking down the path outside, and I immediately stuck my head out of my window, called out to them, and asked who was in the croft. They replied that no one but me was in there. I did not even hesitate. I jumped out of my window, and the moment I was out, I heard the door to my room slam open and heard what I can only describe as a whispered scream of rage. No one in the group ever believed me, but I asked the castle's cook about it, and she explained that there were ghosts in the croft, 3 in fact. one little girl that liked to play pranks, one weeping woman, and one malicious man with a hatred for the living. 2 years ago, I and my wife had a strange experience that I wanted to share. I think it was around November or December 2013, when we were living in an apartment in Meiringen, a suburban town around Stuttgart. Our bedroom was at ground level at the rear corner of the house, with 2 windows to the south and west, facing the inner courtyard between several houses and the driveway to that courtyard. The courtyard was small and private, just big enough to park 2 or 3 cars there. When we go to bed, we usually have the rolling window shutters almost all the way closed, with just maybe leaving a 10-inch gap left open at the bottom. Since Meiringen is a relatively small town next to Stuttgart, we can leave the window cracked open to get some fresh air at night without being bothered by much noise or traffic. This one night, we went to bed and fell asleep. The usual routine when people go to bed, you know. Around 2:15 a.m., we both got woken up by a loud screeching kind of noise, very hard to describe. It sounded like a 5 seconds long mix of a train horn and maybe a circular saw, accompanied by a very bright blue light shining through the shutters of both windows. Keep in mind, both windows facing different directions. We both woke up startled, saw the light for maybe 2 or 3 more seconds, and then it just disappeared. My wife and I were confused, but my still half asleep self was sure it must have been an ambulance passing by, and I went right back to sleep. The next morning, my wife told me she was awake for 15 or 30 more minutes, and she was pretty scared but fell asleep again eventually. Thinking about what happened, I disregarded my spontaneous ambulance theory because, first of all, they don't make screeching noises, second of all, we had ambulances pass our house before, and their light bar usually does not reach our courtyard, and third of all, their blue light bar usually flickers, where our light was a steady, bright light. We asked a few neighbors the next day if they noticed anything strange that night, but no one did. What gets me is that we both, my wife and I, woke up from being deep asleep and that both our descriptions of that event matched exactly. Also, I wonder why I immediately treated this weird situation as if it would be an absolutely normal occurrence and went right back to sleep without feeling threatened at all, while my wife was pretty freaked out about this. To be honest, I have no idea what that could have been. Any ideas about all that? I took my sister, who was visiting from out of state, on a hike the other day in a rural part of the state I live in. Lots of trees, waterfalls, and very little cell phone signal. You get the picture. I'd already had some weird feelings when I saw another car already parked where the trailhead was because we got there on a weekday at 6:30 in the morning. I brushed it off and quieted my intuition because the early bird gets the worm, right? There were several different trails in this natural area, so we started on the one that sounded most interesting. We got maybe a quarter mile down the trail when my sister stepped into a spider web. As she was wrestling with getting it off of her, I felt something that I can best describe as a hot breath hit my ear coming from nowhere, and I don't think I heard a whisper, but I had a thought that wasn't my own that I thought was get out. Now that I had some time to really think about it, I think it was actually get help. I told my sister what just happened, and her natural response was, well, maybe we should leave. So we started making our way back to the trailhead. Just as we were getting ready to leave, I swear I felt something pulling me back in. I convinced her to let us try a different trail. I looked at the sign listing the different trails, and again, intuition told me to take the next one. And we started down. It was supposed to be a loop that led down the river with some falls. The trail hadn't been traveled in at least a day, and I know this because of all the spider webs blocking the path. We get down to the river, and there's a detour with a bridge going across to the other side. I walk across and get down to it, and there is a sweater hanging on the railing. I go to look at it, but I cannot bring myself to touch it. We took a few pictures because it was really pretty, but I couldn't shake the weird feelings I was getting. I kept writing it off as being hungry and tired because I'd skipped breakfast that morning and gone to bed late the night before. We go back up, continue a little further down the trail, and get to a fork in the trail. My sister wants nothing to do with this path because it wasn't marked like the other one was, but being a naturally curious person trying to see some more pretty scenery, I decide I want to go down a little way and see what I can see. I get to a spot where I see a much larger spider in a very pretty web that I could tell took a while, so I stopped to admire it. It was at this moment that, for no apparent reason, I felt uneasy enough to want to turn back around, so I did. We took the other path in the fork a little bit further in, and as we're walking through a certain spot, I get a whiff of something but don't think anything of it. I notice the time on my phone, and we begin to turn around so I can be back home in time for work. On our way back, I get stuck in a spider web, and as I'm wrestling myself out of it, the smell comes back, and it suddenly clicks that it's the unmistakable stench of death. My little sister has never had to smell it, so she thought I was being paranoid. I could have written it off as, oh, We're in the woods, it could be a dead possum or deer nearby. That kind of thing is super common here. I can't shake it. I call the local emergency number and tell them that there's a smell, and they say they'll send some officers out. I also take a screenshot of my map's location because, for some reason, in that exact spot I have service. My sister wants to leave, for obvious reasons, she has jitters, and we have to go meet the officers at the trailhead, so we start making our way out. On our way out, I feel another hot breath on my ear, and I get a sick feeling. We meet the officers, and I give my sister the keys to go sit in the car in the AC, so I know she's somewhere safe. When some guys from the fire department get there, we drive down to another trail entrance that was a little closer to the river, and I use the screenshot of my map to guide us back to where the smell is. From there, this group of about 8 police and firefighters is digging around with heat-sensing equipment to try and locate whatever the smell is. As they're searching, I'm kind of just standing there being useless because I figure, stay out of the way and let them do their job. I stand facing the direction of the river, and I feel what feels like thumps on the back of my head, like someone is standing behind me flicking my head with their finger to get my attention. At one point, one guy with a heat sensor, not sure what they're actually called, but it's like a camera that reads heat, picks up what looks like a humanoid blob of heat, and someone else goes over to where it is and there's nothing there. They write it off as something underground, or maybe the sunshine through the trees on the ground. As they're getting ready to go and write it off as a dead animal somewhere, a few decide to do a quick once-over by the river just to cover all the bases. They took the path that I turned around at where the giant spider was, and it led down to a steep drop-off. I'm walking out with the rest of the officers when I hear one of them yell for everyone else. Would you believe there's a body in the river? I felt instant relief, which sounds odd considering the situation, but it was like a weight had been lifted. They were found. They can be put to rest. I can breathe again. When I get home, I take a shower and sit down for work. My cat does everything she can to lay on me, puts all her weight on me, and purrs so loudly like she's trying to comfort and heal me. I know they can pick up on these things. I know it sounds cliché, but the whole finding a body in the woods thing is a very bad horror movie. I know none of you know me from Adam. I swear, this happened. I don't really know how to move past this. I don't know what I experienced, and I would love to know I'm not alone. On a cold night around 11:50 p.m., my sister was just minding her own business in the living room, where the entrance to our house was. She started hearing 3 faint, soft knocks on the door while our small dog was barking at the covered window while also taking a sniff underneath the door. She told my mom about it and asked me to come with her outside. After going outside and searching around our area, there was nothing to be seen. My mom thinks it's the entities that live on the trees near our house, particularly the large mango trees. As Filipinos, we have very strong beliefs about paranormal creatures, and this wasn't our first incident with them. Almost every night around or past midnight, our dog seems to be always barking at the door or the window. Also, way before our house was built, there was a large Nara tree in the lot, and we've been living on the same spot for over 55 years now. Many years ago, I believe 15 to 20, there was a roundabout down on Somerville Boulevard in the Murdoch/Winthrop area that was rumored to be haunted. For about 3 months or so over the summer, people driving down that road past midnight have told their friends that they spotted a creepy-looking woman with long black hair covering her face, wearing a red semi-see-through nightie, standing in the middle of the roundabout just staring at cars passing by. Not saying anything, not really doing anything, just standing and staring. When my friends and I heard this, we got curious and decided to go there ourselves, especially since one of us lived in Winthrop, so it wasn't a difficult thing to do to wait at his house until it's past midnight. We drove down that road 3 times total, and on the 3rd drive, we did spot something from a distance that looked like it could be a woman in a red dress. But it had disappeared by the time we got closer. And then the summer ended, and the rumors died down, and I don't think anybody has ever seen it again since. I always believed in the paranormal. I've had experiences my whole life. I feel it's a common thread in my family. Both my mother and grandmother are exactly the same. I was dating a guy in my early 20s. He was a little older and owned a beautiful old home. I remember seeing the exterior for the first time and just falling in love with it. That's until I stepped inside. It was instant, that punch in the stomach feeling. I knew something was really off about this house. I didn't say anything, as it wasn't my place. I just hoped the feeling would pass. I went over a few times, but I wouldn't stay the night. The first time I stayed over, my boyfriend went for a morning jog. This was the first time I was alone in the house. I decided to use this time to shower and get ready for the day. It was strange as soon as I got up to walk to the bathroom. The feeling of being watched was extreme. I wasn't wearing clothes, and the feeling of needing to cover up was so strange. I brushed it off and jumped in the shower. I felt the same feeling the whole time in the shower. Imagine showering in front of a creepy stranger, that's how it felt. I went to reach for the towel on the towel rack and couldn't find it. Strange, because that's where it was before I began to shower. I made sure of it. I step out, and it's on the counter by the sink. I don't know how it got there, and that's when I see it. There was a massive handprint on the steamed up mirror. It was clear as day and looked fresh. I was absolutely freaked out. The hand was elongated and almost claw-like. I grabbed my towel and locked myself in the bedroom until my boyfriend returned. When I was 12, I lived in a town called Steuben, in a very old house. It was a town with a population of about 100 people, mostly surrounded by forests, hills, caves, rivers, Indian burial grounds, etc. It was a very beautiful area. Anyway, one night I was on the computer, which was in our kitchen, sometime in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden I heard what sounded like someone or something breathing very sickly next to me. I got up and, of course, was confused and tried to find the source of where this sound could be coming from. Except whenever I'd think I'd point it and walk toward it, it would move about the kitchen and would end up behind me or in a different direction. I was completely freaked out and went upstairs to my bedroom and stayed there until the sun came up. When it did, I immediately went downstairs to tell my mom when she woke up. The first thing I said to her was, "I have something I want to tell you," and she said, "I have something I want to tell you about too," and told me to go first. So I told her about the sound I had, and her jaw dropped, and she told me that she was about to tell me the same thing, that when she had been getting up early in the morning and would have her coffee and go on the computer, she had been hearing this breathing sound. Afterwards, this thing came around like clockwork, always in the middle of the night, for about 2 weeks. Until one night I finally broke down and had had enough of it and screamed at it to leave us in hell alone and go away. It stopped immediately after I screamed that, and we never heard it again after that. This experience has stuck with me all my life, and I've never been able to fully put my finger on a rational explanation. I'm convinced this house was haunted as I had other strange experiences in this house at the time, such as hearing my name said in the living room, seeing a dark figure with a large melon-shaped head, and my mattress being shook violently during the day while laying on it and talking to a friend of mine on the phone. These experiences, and others, are what made me so interested in the unknown. I try to have a bit of healthy skepticism and mostly take everything else I see or hear with a grain of salt, but at the same time there is this internal battle because of my own experiences, which I've seen firsthand and a few with witnesses. I thought I'd share and see if anyone has had anything similar happen or if I am crazy for thinking that there might just be things out there that we don't know. I will add that these types of experiences faded as I got older. I'm 32 now, but strange things still have and do occur once in a while. In 2002, I lived on a mountain in southern New Hampshire for a few years. The mountain used to be mined for iron ore, so there are places at the top where the radio tower is located that have tunnels in the land that, if you fell in, no one would find you. We had a small house that was located in a clearing where there were woods all around us and a dirt road that just barely allowed 2 cars to pass each other. In the summertime, we would wake up to see spotlights shining from above and shutting off, followed by the sounds of helicopters. We knew they were looking for pot growers. I had never come across these growers, but being on the state line between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, it would not surprise me. After a few years of seeing these spotlights and hearing the helicopter, it became nothing new until one night. Our windows were open, so the evening breeze would flow through the house, and you could hear the comforting sounds of crickets. I woke up because there was a bright spotlight over our house. Again, I thought. I tried to go back to sleep, but for some reason, I had a strange feeling. The crickets were no longer chirping. I decided to get up and check on our 2 boys in the nursery, then headed to the bathroom. After seeing they were sound asleep, I started to close their door when another bright spotlight lit up our dark home. It was then that I noticed I did not hear the helicopters. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears. The light went out, and I shrugged. I headed to the bathroom. I never turned on the lights when I went to the bathroom or moved around the house at night. Even though it was very dark and there were no street lights, I found that I knew our home well and could see pretty well at night. I went to the bathroom, and again, the bathroom lit up with a spotlight over the house. I finished up and decided I would head out to the back deck and see if I could tell what was going on. But as I started to unlock the door, I had a strange feeling. This was not a good idea. I could not figure out why, but I did as my gut told me to. I walked back to our bedroom, and the light seemed to dim. I remember thinking that I had never seen the spotlights dimming before, nor had I seen the spotlights staying over our house for so long. I paused at the bedroom door, listening. I decided to wake my husband. I walked in, and I saw a tall figure standing by my bed. I am 5 feet 6, and my husband is 6 feet 2. He usually sleeps in bed, so when I saw a tall figure next to my bed, I thought he had gotten up and realized I was not there and was checking on me. I walked by the figure, and I even put my hand on his chest. I said, "I was sorry, I was in the bathroom." The dim light went out, and the figure headed out the bedroom door. I suddenly heard my husband snoring. It startled me. Who was standing by my side of the bed? I do not know why I never woke my husband up, but I sprinted out the bedroom door and immediately headed to the boys' room in a panic. I opened the door and flicked on a small light that gave just enough shine to not wake them, but I could see them in the room. They are both in bed. I closed the windows, and the door went to the kitchen for a knife. Someone is in my house. I started flicking on the lights and checked every room. They were all clear. I checked the attic and the basement. They were all clear. I checked to make sure all the doors were locked. What? My husband awoke and came out, rubbing his eyes. He asked what I was doing. I just said someone was in the house. Before he could react, the spotlight came back on and shut off again. Now that my husband was up, I ran to the sliders to go out to the deck, and when I went out, the spotlight went off. My husband joined me, and we watched something in the sky that did not make any noise, hovering slowly over the trees, shining the spotlight, then shutting it off, moving a little, on, off. Over and over until we could no longer see the light. I still have no idea what that was or who I saw standing next to my bed. My husband took his gun out and did a thorough check of our house. No one was there. Alright, I will tell you all the strangest supernatural encounter I have ever had. It's 2013, and I'm in Afghanistan, asleep. I am awoken by a presence. When my eyes adjust, I clearly see my uncle sitting on the cot next to me in 80s era dress greens. Only he looked younger than when I knew him. He stared at me with a look on his face, like he was trying to communicate something to me, but he never made a sound or gesture. He just solemnly sat there for a few minutes, then got up and walked out. As he is walking out the door, he turns around and says "Budairo" to me. That's what he called me, and it looks like it takes all the effort he has to say that. My uncle killed himself in Alabama in 2009. Also, I had never ever seen a picture of him in dress greens. After I got back from deployment, my grandmother pulled out some photos I had never seen, and as we went through them, one made me just about have a heart attack. My uncle in dress greens, dated 1985. He looked exactly like my experience. One more time, in 2015, I was out for a late night walk and clearly saw him, again in dress greens, on the other side of the street walking the other way. That SHT still gives me chills. Does anyone know what to make of this? So this was like 2 years ago. I live in a townhouse in a pretty suburban area. There are like 3 fields surrounding the area I live in. Anyway, I was home alone, and it was pretty late at night. My mom and her boyfriend were up north for the weekend. I was making some food when I heard strange noises, like banging on the walls and stuff. I brushed it off because I have noisy neighbors. But I was really paranoid, so I texted my neighbor and asked if they were home or something. They weren't. So I really started freaking out. I'm home alone, my neighbors aren't either, and it's like 2 in the morning. The banging noises got louder. It sounded like it was from my basement. Maybe it was my washer or something, and I calmed down a little. I went in my basement, like some stupid shit in a horror movie, to see if it was just my laundry. It turns out that's not on. I left the basement quickly, panic rushing back to me. I just went to my room, totally forgetting about my food, and sat on my bed. I ended up laying down. Now, a little break from the story. I have the master bedroom in my house, and I have 2 closets. One is a walk-in closet, and one is like a regular closet. My walk-in closet has a light, but the light barely works. Okay, back to the story. Out of the corner of my eye, I see that the light in my closet is on, which is really weird for me because it doesn't work. I literally wanted to cry, like, why is this happening to me? Again, like a dumb shit from a horror movie, I opened my closet door and the light shut off, and I could barely make it out, but a tall, skinny figure was standing in the very back of my closet. I closed the door really fast. I felt like screaming, but I didn't. I ended up going outside for a while and sitting on a bench outside my house. I don't really know if I was just seeing things or if I really saw something paranormal, but it was scary. Me and my family used to live in a 2-story house. The second floor was made of wood, while the first floor had been cemented down. However, I didn't quite understand at first why it was built this way. This was abroad, and as a 7-year-old, I didn't pay much attention to it. At the time, it had only been me, my older sister, and a maid since my parents were both working at the time and would often come home late at night. We had spent most of the day in the downstairs area playing with toys when my older sister asked me to go with her to the second floor. We had never been up there because my parents had given specific instructions not to venture up there without them, but knowing my stubborn sister and her curiosity, she would go up there with or without me. I was reluctant at first since I was the scaredy cat out of the both of us, but she eventually persuaded me. Our mom was busy washing dishes at the time. She didn't notice that we had left the living room to head up to the second floor. On our way up there, the floors were already creaking, and you could smell that they were old. When we saw the second floor, it looked like time had stopped and we were in a different period. The second floor seemed untouched. There was a rocking chair to the side of the room next to a window and a crib a few feet away, as well as a small cabinet. From the looks of it, it had obviously been a nursery. We started to look around as my sister walked over to try the rocking chair, then checked the crib. A few minutes had passed, and I had noticed my sister hadn't moved from where she stood. I walked up to her to see what was going on. She had been staring at what seemed like a large brown stain in the middle of a crib. As she went in to touch it, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck begin to stand up. I felt this surge of panic and grabbed my sister by the collar and dragged her right out of there. I didn't know what it was that made me make a run for it while I dragged my sister with me, but something about the crib made me feel incredibly off and only heightened when my sister went to touch it. That night, as we ate dinner, I confessed to my parents that we had explored the second floor despite being told not to, and I was scolded as we ate. After everything had calmed down, I asked my mom why we were prohibited from being up there since we were only going to live in the house for a couple months before we would eventually move out to our permanent home. We asked the owner the following day over the phone. It turns out the owner of the house lost her daughter and grandchild in this same house on the second floor. She had come home to her psychotic husband, who had smothered their baby with a blanket because she wouldn't stop crying. As her daughter went to get her husband out of the way to grab her baby, he had been caught off guard and had elbowed her in the face, causing her to hit her head hard on the floor. Her daughter and grandchild didn't survive the incident, and the husband was put in jail. The owner hadn't moved anything in on the second floor since the incident, saying she felt something was up there and felt angry since her daughter and grandchild's deaths. She had wanted to get the house renovated and have the second floor destroyed to turn it into a one-story home to hopefully be able to rent it out, which is why she hired my parents, who allowed us to temporarily live here but had strict instructions not to go to the second floor but wouldn't disclose what happened as it drove people away. Needless to say, we left that house earlier than the agreed-upon stay and haven't been back there since. When I was still married to my military husband, he was overseas, and I moved our daughters and myself to our follow-on duty station. I rented a 100-year-old house. It was wonderful to be out in a rural area with a huge yard. The only problem was that it had mysterious happenings. One of the things that I soon learned happened on a regular basis was the knocker. The basement of the house was very dark and damp. My washer and dryer and deep freeze were in the basement, so I did have to go down there quite often. I never let my two young children down in it due to the darkness and dampness. The only entrance to the basement was a door located in the kitchen. It happened to be right next to the back door, which was also in the kitchen. Not long after we moved in, I heard knocking on the back door. Thinking it must be a neighbor, I went to answer it. As I approached the door, I realized it wasn't the back door. It was the basement door. I knew my children were in the living room and couldn't figure out who would be in my basement. I opened the door to no one. This occurred on a regular basis. At least once a week, I heard the knocker. The neighbors and owner of the home knew nothing about it. I also hung a photo of my husband and me on the wall by the front door. Many mornings, I came in to find it either hanging upside down or laying on the floor beneath one of the chairs or sofas. I would replace the photo and leave it at that. My parents came to visit one weekend. We were sitting in the living room, and suddenly, we heard someone knocking on the back door. I tried to ignore it, but my, very practical, mother insisted on answering the door. I followed her to the door, insisting she just ignore it. She thought I was terribly rude. Then she opened the door. Realizing there was no one there, she literally stalked back into the living room, picked up her purse, and as she was going out the door, said, "Mel, I'll be in the car." He drove her for 3 hours home, and she refused to ever come back. Another time, after my husband returned from overseas, we had guests and were sitting in the living room. Suddenly, the husband stopped talking and was staring at the wall next to the front door. He said, "Susan, get the baby. It's time to go home." We followed his stare to the front door and watched as the photo of my husband and myself slowly turned upside down. There were other strange occurrences, and it soon became apparent that whatever it was did not like my husband at all. If he upset me or the children in any way, things picked up, and something bad happened to him. One day, following an argument, he left to drive to a local Kmart. He called me from the store. He was almost to the store when the left driver's side rear wheel came off the truck, and he wrecked the truck. He apologized to me. He called the entity Hardy. It followed us to our next base and left when we divorced. It was the summer of 2014. I was waking up to an L-shaped corridor on the first floor of our family home. The corridor section just outside my room has no roof. So back then I used to trouble with sleep. I was insomniac, and the only thing that helped me go to sleep was extensive walks on the corridor for hours to tire myself to sleep. I made sure to utilize the whole length of corridors from one end to another to gain the maximum number of steps, helping me exhaust better. After 1 month of my night walking, I discovered the joy of stargazing through the roofless section of the corridor. Back then, I was a beginner in astronomy, so self-observation was a good time pass and delightful. I often used to gaze at the moonlight, which assured me that it wasn't really that dark or spooky. Also, my 3 pet dogs used to sleep on the sides of the corridor, so I felt accompanied even in those late hours. Anyway, our home is neither haunted nor too old. Have no history of deaths within property, and the neighborhood is a typical one with no such dark history. So during my 3rd month of night waking, that night, around 1 a.m., I started to feel like I was being watched. My shoulders started to feel tensed, and my steps were getting irregular and wobbly. I still remember that feeling of uneasiness. Never in my life have I felt this way. At first, I shrugged off this feeling because there was no way that anyone would be interested in watching a dude take his usual boring walk. I completely disregarded it at first since night walking was not a new thing to me. However, as time passed, the same sensation crawled up on me again. With each passing minute, stronger than before. Okay. Something is off. In the middle of this unnerving feeling, I was still waking and didn't stop while experiencing all this. Walking helps me think straight. Still do. The time is 2:30 a.m. I then focused my senses on this, and after 4 to 6 end-to-end rounds of corridors, I was able to pinpoint that the only time I feel like watching is while I take the turn to the second corridor. With that, I was determined to catch the culprit red-handed. Okay, this time. I planned to go to the roofless section and instantly stop in the middle and turn around to watch. What I saw still haunts me. I saw a humanoid, dark gray face with a thin neck staring back at me from probably 3 meters away. His face was peeping through the siding of the first floor. As if he were playing hide and seek with me. There were 2 black gaping holes in the spot where there should be eyes. Its mouth was all disoriented, like it had no frigging jaw. Oh, did I mention that it had gray horns too? As long as its face and pointy ends. Just after a second of my hard glance towards it, it sank its face downwards, like it tried to hide from me. In total disbelief about what I saw, I ran towards it. During that moment, I thought that it was one of my dogs, and I looked straight down to catch a second glimpse of whatever it was. But to my avail, nothing. Like, it just vanished in a few seconds. I looked down at the rain shed, which is between the first and ground floors, and saw nothing. No movements. It was all silent. I checked on the dogs, and all 3 of them were half asleep. I probably broke their deep sleep by running. As for that thing and the way its face was positioned, it was supposed to be standing on top of a rain shed, and due to the fact that it was able to pull down its face from the siding, that creature must have been around 9 feet tall. The gap between the first floor balcony and rain shed is 8 feet. This fact alone made me convinced that what I saw that night was inhuman. Just what in the world did I see that night? Demon? Alien? Skinwalker? What chills me the most is that the thing watched me for hours. Taking its time. During those days, I walked outside till 4 a.m. While living in Philadelphia, a friend and I were meeting some people at an old historic house inside Fairmount Park for some political function. We knew someone who was a groundskeeper there, and he would unlock the houses if we needed to. The house itself stood atop a small hill with a winding path down to the parking lot. It was at least 300 years old. It was dusk, and the sun was just starting to go down. The house was dark inside, but as we approached, we saw the curtain move aside in one of the windows. A face looked down at us, watching us approach, like a mother would watch her kids coming home from school. We figured that people had arrived before us and were already inside. As we stepped closer, the face moved away from the window, and the curtain fell back in place. We found the door locked and waited for the guy to show the key. We asked him if anyone could be in there, and he told us that he hadn't opened that house in weeks. My friend and I just stared at each other. Once we got inside, we found the house completely empty. Back in 2014, I, a male of 28, was out camping with my friends in the Amamore region of Queensland. There were Phil and Tony, my ute, and an esky full of grog and sausages. We were set for a good campout. We were driving through the forest through some of the 4WD tracks and found a secluded spot by a creek to set up camp for the night. We were sitting around a fire with a Barbie and a couple tinnies and sitting back with a fish. We were catching mostly dewfish, except for one fair-sized bass and a turtle. Sometime through the night, everything seemed to go silent. It was a fairly bright night, and earlier, the birds were crying out, frogs were frogging, and crickets were chirping. Now, as we were all getting tired and the conversation lulled, we noticed it. Silence except for the fire and the sounds of the creek. It was unnerving. Phil noted it out loud, and the unease in the glances between each of us made the moment feel more tense. It was broken when a loud splash sounded from up the creek. It was like a massive rock was thrown into the water. We all gazed toward the sound, but nothing could be seen. We assumed it was a fish jumping in the creek or a branch falling or something. After a few terrifying minutes, the sounds of the animals began again, and it was as if the silence never existed. We put off sleep for a while to clear the nerves. Tony hooked something big, and we excitedly watched as his line snapped. Phil and I tried casting out, and we both caught nothing but snags. We set up swags in a triangle around the fire and decided to call it a night. Within minutes, Phil was fast asleep and snoring loudly. I was gazing up at the stars through my fly screen, just about to drift off to sleep, when I noticed that the silence had returned. It was only Phil's snoring and the lapping of the water along the shallows that sounded. The fire had died down a bit by now, and the wind was still. I could hear sporadic things, leaves scuffling and twigs breaking every now and again. Isolated nature sounds amongst the silence. My heart stopped when I heard some stones on the riverbank move. When it sounded again, not once but twice, I began to hold my breath. Initially, I shook my head at myself. It was just a critter of some sort, no doubt, but the back of my mind was telling me it sounded awfully like footsteps. I took shallow breaths as I waited for the sound again, but it was silent for a good minute. I had finally just begun to breathe normally when I heard the sound again, but from the other side of my swag, a few meters away. I could hear sniffing, then the sound of stealthy movement as this thing creeped across the ground toward my swag. The flap was pulled down so I could see the sky and the fire. The other side was still covered. I could hear this thing breathing heavy breaths on the other side of the canvas, and then I heard the sounds of something touching the canvas itself, centimeters from my face. At the time, I assumed it was a wild dog or perhaps even a pig, unlikely, but my head was swimming. The sniffing sounded peculiar, the nostrils sounded large, like the breathing was more hollow. I could see the canvas move in towards me as whatever was inspected, my thin cocoon. I felt trapped. The canvas was moving toward the mozzie netting, and then I saw it. Brownish yellow long fingers with obsidian black nails. I'm not going to lie, I screamed the loudest, highest pitched squeal I think anyone could manage. I flipped shit, I started kicking and flailing. Tony let out a "what the duck?" Before an even more expressive "what the duck?" Before flipping out like I was. I heard a loud whoop sound from a distance, and the thing that was above me ran away from our screams across the river bank and loudly crashed into the water. Phil began shouting as he awoke to our panic and heard the splashing. Tony and I had already scrambled out of our swags and were legging it to the car. I could have beat Kathy Freeman that night. Phil joined us as we shouted at him to get to the duck over. He didn't need much persuasion as he looked at our strawn belongings and terrified faces. We got in the ute, leaving our stuff behind. My dad was pissed because it was his swag I was using, and as I turned on the headlights, a yellowish brown and abnormally tall person moved behind a large tree. Phil saw what we saw this time and started going mental. I floored it through that forest. I ducked some panels, and my suspension hated me for it, but we got the duck out of that forest. Every creek crossing was terrifying. We finally got off the dirt roads and were heading back toward town. We crossed a small bridge, and from one side to the other, there was a trail of splashed water, as if something or someone dripping wet moved from one side to the other. It could have just been water, but after what we saw, we were convinced it was the same creature. Tony said later on that he saw the thing crouched over my swag when I screamed. He said he had his eyes closed and was listening to the sounds of a weird swirling sound in the water. He said he had never heard footsteps. He told me the creature had overly large eyes and was all cheekbones and head ridges. He reckons it was an alien. I reckon differently. That was the last time I went camping with the boys. I later moved to the city, but whenever I go back near the area and drive over a creek or the river, I'm waiting to look down and see eyes staring up at me from the water. I don't know what it was and don't plan on finding out. I don't go near bodies of water anymore, even the beach gives me the heebie-jeebs. Does anyone know what the duck we came across that night? I haven't heard anything remotely similar to this anywhere around here. When we tell people, they think we're talking shit, but we all saw something, and we agree it was human-like, but it was no person. The creek leads into the Mary River, which is home to prehistoric creatures like the lungfish. Something strange lives in those depths. When I was probably 10 or 11, I think we moved to a new house that we dubbed the tree house. There was a garage and separate apartment down the stairs, and you had to walk up the stairs outside to get to the actual house, which was on the second story. The first time there, I was running up the stairs, middle of summer, and about halfway up, I got this chill through my stomach, and then it felt like I got pushed. Luckily, I didn't fall. My sister and I were riding our scooters one day around the wraparound porch, and she stopped to catch her breath or something. I can't remember exactly when she was leaning on the railing when she just fell through and landed on the rocks below. To this day, we don't know how she fell. No scratches or anything either. Lots of other stuff happened, but the parents never believed it. Back in 2018, me and my family moved into a new house in Pennypack, a neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it was bigger than our last house, with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. I enjoyed the house. I got the second biggest room since I'm the oldest sibling out of the 3 of us. My room included a walk-in closet, my own half bathroom, and an extra big closet area for anything else I had in my room. It was big enough to be a second room. I was planning on turning it into an area to do my YouTube, so I decided to unpack and put everything in the right place. Then I was going to explore the rest of the house. So I started setting up my PC, mic, and stuff for my YouTube in the room, and then I noticed it. It was a little cubby hole big enough to crawl in and hide if we were to play hide and seek. So, being 15 and stupid, I decided later that night to call up my friends and hang out so we could play hide and seek. They didn't know about the cubbyhole yet until I hid there during the entire game, and no one could find me. I was the winner, so I crawled out of the cubbyhole and told my friends where I was. And I didn't know at that moment that being in that cubbyhole would change my life. The cubbyhole had old, vintage-looking wallpaper and flowers, like you would see in a 90s movie, and it was normally dark in there, but I wasn't scared of the dark, so it didn't bother me. But after I came out of that cubbyhole a week later, weird stuff started happening. What first happened was that I was in my room and the power blew out, and I was like, no big deal, maybe a fuse blew, so I ran downstairs to check the power box, but everything was in the right place where it had to be. So I was a little confused, but I brushed it off and went to bed early. 2 days later, my mom was at work, my siblings were with our dad, and I was home alone, which didn't bother me. I'm normally home alone all the time, but that night something stranger even happened. I remember hearing something making noise in my room, the one with the cubby hole, so I open it up, and nothing is there, not even in the hole, so I shut the doors and lay back down. Then I heard a loud, high-pitched scream and heavy banging coming from the same room, so now I was freaked out. I didn't get out of bed because I couldn't, and I was paralyzed and frozen. Around 4 a.m., everything stopped, and I finally went to bed at 4:30. Another 2 days later, I'm about to go into the shower and take care of my hygiene, and again, I'm all alone, no one was home and all my doors were locked shut. So I get out of the shower and I see a smiley face drawn on the foggy mirror, and now I'm super scared because no one was home and I didn't do it. I was in the shower, so I decided to call my mom and ask her if my friends could spend the night. It was summer, so I doubt she would have said no, and she said yes. Of course, my mom and my siblings stayed at my dad's house for a week so me and my friends could chill, so my friends came over, and were chilling doing what typical teenage guys do, play games and talk about females. So everyone is playing and vibing, and I get up to go to the bathroom, and one of my friends notices something on my back shoulder. He says, "What's that on your shoulder?" And I say, "What are you talking about?" He says, "It looks like someone carved a smiley face on your shoulder," and I do not know. I never felt any pain or anything, but he took a picture and showed me, and it was the same face from the mirror. I had a weird occurrence once when I was a teenager, maybe about 15 or 16. I really don't remember. Sometime in the mid-2000s. I spent most of my early to late teenage years in a small town called Cresco, Iowa. So let's set the scene for this story. I woke up early on a cold Sunday morning while it was still dark out. I got up at about 5 in the morning to get ready for my paper route job. I got all of my stuff ready and into my courier bags to set out on my route, leaving my house to start the job. Once I left my house, I started to walk down the sidewalk to the corner of the intersection to cross the street in order to get to the next street over to head north. I have to pass a large 3-story building that I believe used to be an old school at one time that is now just used for storage, and what about the fitness center that is attached to my right, a few houses, and an alleyway to my left? I had a weird feeling that something was wrong, and I looked over to the opening of the alleyway and saw the weirdest and creepiest thing ever. Underneath the lamppost, illuminated by the light, was a puddle of darkness. I have no idea what it was. Ooze? I know it wasn't water. It moved and rippled like it, but it wasn't it. I just stared at it for like a few seconds, and I was like, nope. Not today. And I just sped away from the area to do my job. I returned like a half an hour later, while it was still dark out, and it wasn't there anymore. Like, what the hell was it? A figment of my imagination? A doorway to hell? Ooze from another world? I don't know. Cresco had strange and ducked up bouts of weirdness going on in that small town. I'm just looking to find answers about it. I once asked a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator about it, and they said it was probably a doorway to something or a creature. So yeah. I don't know what it was. When I was 11 years old, I woke up one night and saw a man standing in my room, opening and closing my dresser drawers. He was tall, pale, and shiny, but he looked corporeal, not translucent, ghostly, or anything. I couldn't move at all, but I pissed myself instantly. I shut my eyes as tight as I could, but when I opened them, he was still there, opening and closing drawers. I kept my eyes closed for a long time, and finally, after what seemed like hours, he was gone. The next morning, a lot of my shirts and pants were tied in knots. I came to the conclusion that I had a very vivid dream, and perhaps my sister played a joke on me by tying my clothes in knots. Flash forward 15 years. We had long since moved out of the house, and no one had lived there since. I stopped by one day with my mom and two aunts, who had lived in the same house when they were kids. When we walked into my bedroom, my mom and my older aunt started teasing my younger aunt about the silver man she saw one time. My jaw hit the ducking floor. I was maybe around 10 to 12, and I was staying at my cousin's house for the week. My cousin lives in a pretty small area, with farmland surrounding it. One of those fields has a house that was locked. Everything was locked. Back doors, windows, etc. If that wasn't already bad enough, the only thing that wasn't locked was the garage door, which was somewhat open. None of us could fit under it, though, so we explored the outside and set the driveway as a little hangout spot since it was the easiest spot for our other friends to get to. We always made dumb ghost stories and explored the backyard since the fence gate was broken. The backyard had a shed that looked very, very old. It was sealed shut, so we could never open it. The only thing that I could describe that shed is the fact that it had a very disgusting smell coming from it. It smelled so bad that it made some of our friends actually puke, including me. But with our dumb little minds, one day we decided to get inside. We couldn't get inside through any of the windows because we were way too small. We could barely even see inside the house through the windows. So we went through the front door. I already said the entire house was locked, but the door was old, and the lock on it looked busted. So we took our chances and kicked the door down. It was already a stupid idea for us to do, but we got it off after 2 days of us throwing stuff, kicking it, and slamming bodies into it. I should say it was completely off, we just broke it enough so we could squeeze in. Once we were inside, we started exploring, looking for anything cool or spooky that we always thought was inside. I ended up parting ways from my friends and my cousin and going into this one room. It had wallpaper falling off, the fan and light on the floor were broken, and the door wouldn't budge. The closet was shut with a somewhat broken mirror on it. That was the room that started it all. The only thing it had in it was a chair. It was a wooden rocking chair. It looked straight out of a horror movie. But it started as a joke in our friend group. We always made jokes about whoever dared to sit in it would be possessed, etc. Dumb kid stuff, you know? Anyway, we started exploring again and didn't really find anything interesting. The only thing that was interesting was the chair. I went back to the room and just stared at the chair. I didn't know what else to do. I was too scared to go near it or pick it up. I didn't want to touch it. It gave me a weird feeling, not like being watched or anything. It just made me feel off. It made me feel like I was sitting in a different universe. After a bit of goofing off, we went back home. It was sunset, and we wanted to go home to not worry our parents. But my cousin stopped on our way home and pulled her phone out. She sent a text and turned around. I was confused and asked her what she was doing. In which she said she left something in the house and wanted to get it. I didn't like that idea, but I had no clue where home was and had to follow her. Once we got back in, I looked up at one of the windows, and the only thing I saw was a figure. It didn't really look like it had any eyes or anything, but as soon as I pointed it out to my cousin, it was gone. It might have been just my eyes messing with me, but I was already spooked enough and didn't want to go inside, and I also didn't want to stay outside. I was in an area I didn't know, and it was starting to get dark, and my cousin was the only one with a light. Once we got in, I got this feeling that I was being watched. It felt like I had a million eyes on me, which my cousin also agreed to. She took us straight to the room I didn't want to be near, the only room that had something in it. She said she wanted to take a picture of the chair and everything, but once we got there, I was freaking out. It sounded like someone was scraping nails on the wall. I had no clue where the sound was coming from, but it sounded like it was just getting closer. Once we got into the room and she got the picture, we turned to leave. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the same black figure. This time it actually had eyes. It wasn't red or white eyes, but just pitch black eyes. It looked like we were staring into a black hole. I knew my cousin could see it since she was freaking out. Her phone light went out, and all I heard were the sounds of running coming from the direction we saw the figure. We bolted. I never ran so fast in my life. It felt like if I didn't get out, I would have been done for, so we ran. To me, it felt like we ran for ages. It felt like the exit was so far away. I saw my cousin bolt out, and I scrambled to get out. I already had a hard enough time getting in without panicking. Once I got out, we bolted home. The only thing we could do was run. We just wanted to go home. Sadly, it didn't just stop there. When we were home, I kept having a bunch of nightmares, and at the window in my cousin's room that looked straight into one of the fields, whenever we looked out, we kept seeing the same figure, still staring at us with the same black eyes. After a bit, it was finally spotted. I stopped having nightmares, and we stopped seeing the figure. This may sound stupid and all, and everything might have been just a play on our minds and eyes, but it creeped me the hell out. If I think of that place, almost everything looks like a blur. But that room and that goddamn chair are the only things I can remember about what they look like. In early 2007, I was in a traveling singing group. There were 8 of us on a team, and the team members were switched every year. We were invited to stay the evening at the house of a previous member named Drew. Drew wasn't home, so it was his mom, his sister, and his brother who hosted us. Now we'd all known that Drew's dad died about 4 years earlier, but he died of a heart attack and not in the house. I generally try not to be superstitious, but I went into the house and immediately felt a little uncomfortable. I blamed it on the fact that Drew and I had never really seen eye to eye, or that I felt bad for his mom, who had been widowed so young and left with 3 children. As sleeping space was limited, I got put down on a cot in the basement, along with another girl on my team. The basement wasn't a creepy basement by any means. It had been refinished and was pretty comfortable. My cot was only about a foot from the wall, and there was a small, old, digital clock between the wall and the cot. I fell asleep in my usual manner, facing the wall, back to the room. At 2:48 a.m., I'll never forget the clock since it was the only thing I could focus on. I woke up very suddenly. I was immediately frozen in bed, my heart was racing, my throat went tight, and I couldn't swallow. It was primal fear at its best. I couldn't roll over to check, but I swear, even now, that something was standing over me. Everything in my instincts told me not to turn around. It felt like my life depended on me staying right where I was. During this time of intense fear, I kept seeing images in my mind, flashes of gore and plain out horrible things. I could hear a laugh in my ears, but not the voice of just one person laughing. It sounded like I was in a room with thousands of things. I remember for the first time having suicide cross my mind during this overwhelming, fear-driven time. I should note that I am not and have never been suicidal. When the feeling went away, the last thing I remember hearing in my mind was, "Not this one." I looked at the clock again, and only 9 minutes had passed. Longest ducking 9 minutes of my life. A few hours later, when I got up, I decided I was going to get the hell out of there as quickly as I possibly could. I skipped a shower and breakfast and sat in the van, waiting for the rest of my team. As I was waiting, Drew's brother came out and spoke with me. He said one sentence. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you this morning." As he said it, he had tears in his eyes. He honestly looked like he was going to be sick to me. The look of hopelessness in his eyes still haunts me. 2 weeks later, we got word that Drew's brother killed himself just before 3 a.m. Ever since the incident, I still have dreams of laughing. Part of me wonders if I would have just tried talking to his brother. Maybe things would be different. I've never spoken about this to anyone but my husband. It brings back a chill to my spine and a sense of guilt. I don't know what to make of it or what the hell really happened in that house. Part of me never wants to know. I'm almost 60 years old, and I'm a wildlife and landscape photographer from East Tennessee. I'm from Townsend, which is located in the Smoky Mountains, and I no longer live at the location where this happened, but I'm still close by. On the night of the new moon in July of 2018, my best friend, Deb, came over to my house around 1130 p.m. because we were going to go up the hill from my house to an empty rental cabin to take pictures of the Milky Way over Rich Mountain. I know it was the night of the new moon because that's the best night of the month for night sky photography since the moon won't wash out the light from the stars. If you stood on my road where you turned into my driveway, it actually looked like you're turning into the driveway of the rental cabin because we shared that driveway. You pull into the rental and curve left down our long gravel driveway to the mobile home we lived in before we moved into the house where we are now. Straight across the street from the rental cabin is what locals have always called the shale pit. It's just an empty lot, about an acre or two. There's a family from Townsend who owns it, and they use it to dig up shale for new driveways for houses. That was their business. They built driveways, but their part was just to dig them and lay down the shale. They also let the national park bring trees there to use the space to burn them after they collected them when we'd have bad storms, strong winds, or heavy snow. There wasn't a house there or any other form of structure, just a big lot with a couple of backhoes for digging. They did put a small mobile home on the lot for the owner's grandson, but that didn't happen until 2020, during the pandemic. Okay, here it goes. Deb and I had taken her car up the driveway to the rental cabin, and we parked right in the front, and her car was parallel to the road. The road was about 10 yards from the car, and the entrance to the shale pit was across the one-lane road we lived on, so about 10 more yards. That means 20 yards total from the car to the entrance of the shale pit. We set our tripods up and had each taken a couple of shots of the night sky when I heard what sounded like tires on gravel somewhere down at the river. You have to cross a bridge over the river to get to my old house and all the houses on that road, the shale pit included, of course. I said out loud to her, "Someone is down at the river." I can't remember if she heard it. Just a few seconds later, we heard a loud truck that sounded like it was crossing the bridge and starting up my road. It might be 1/4 mile from the bridge to my driveway, probably less. We could hear that the truck was going really slowly, and it sounded like it was really old and barely running. As it got closer, I asked Deb if she had locked her car since we were on the back side of the cabin and couldn't see it from there. She said she hadn't. Deb has thousands of dollars worth of camera gear, and she had a lot of it with her that night. Without speaking, we both took our cameras off our tripods and carried them and the tripods back to her car to lock them. I don't remember why we brought it all with us. I think we both just had a weird feeling about that truck. I know I definitely did. I don't even know what to say other than that it sounded like it was creeping around the area because it was going so slowly. I could have walked as fast as that truck was going. When we got back to her car, we set our stuff in the back seat right as the truck got to where it was, even with the cabin and us. It was a dark colored truck, and it looked like it could have maybe been something like a Chevy S10 made back in the 70s or 80s. We couldn't see who was driving or how many people were in it. The truck stopped and turned into the driveway to the cabin, which means it was also turning into my driveway. It only got 2 wheels onto the property when it stopped and backed up across the street into the entrance of the shale pit. Its lights were shining directly into our eyes. It just sat there with its loud, sad motor running. Deb asked me what the hell they were doing, and I said, "I don't know, but they're starting to piss me off because they know they're blinding us with their headlights." I waited about 10 more seconds before I reached into my pocket, pulled out my maglite flashlight, and turned the dial around the bulb to high beam. Then I turned it on and pointed it right at the truck. I had intended on shining my obnoxiously bright flashlight at them until they turned their headlights off or drove away. Well, they did turn their headlights off, and in turn, I turned my flashlight off. They didn't turn the motor off, though. This was creepy, and my stomach kind of churned because I thought I had pissed them off, and we were up at that empty rental cabin after midnight, and my husband was all the way back down at our house asleep. The truck stayed there for about another half a minute, and then it finally turned its motor off, and it was gone. Yes. I swear, upon everything I've ever loved, that truck just wasn't there anymore. We didn't see it fade away, it didn't turn off like a light switch or television, it just wasn't there anymore. Then Deb and I both did something totally out of character for 2 old ladies. We ran to where the truck had been sitting. I couldn't say a word, but Deb, well, she yelled over and over. "What the FCK did I just see? What the FCK did I just see?" I told her to stop screaming so I could call Jack, my husband. I was hysterical, and I told him to get up the hill as fast as he could. He also drove up instead of walking, and he was there in no more than 2 minutes. I told him a very short version of what happened, and he went across the street to the shale pit and pulled in as far as he could. It's all just dirt and rock, there aren't even trees there since they dig in the area. The only trees the park brings there are to burn, and there weren't any of those at this time. He came back across the street and said there's nobody and nothing over there except the 2 backhoes. They must have left, and you just didn't see them. Lol. Then we explained the whole thing again, and he realized they couldn't have left without us seeing them since we were standing right in front of them. So, He went back over there on foot this time with my flashlight since it has the high beam setting on it. Again, he came back and said there's nothing there. He said he even looked inside the cabs of the backhoes just in case. There's actually a ridge above the shale pit lot, but it's vertical and about 100 feet high. This 1-acre lot is literally just dirt and rock, with nowhere to go or nowhere to hide, even for a person, let alone a whole truck. We didn't take any more pictures. We went back down to the house, and Jack went inside. I was outside with Deb, and she said, "Kelly, there's no need to go in there and try to convince him of what we saw. It's ridiculous, and you can't expect him to believe you. It'll just cause an argument. We saw what we saw, but nobody is ever going to believe us. And now, we don't even believe us. Lol. We talk about it sometimes and laugh about it, but it's not really all that funny. Because even though we know we saw, what did we see? If it were a scary movie, you'd think the truck would turn the motor off first, leave the headlights on, and then disappear. But no, it turned off its lights, and we could very clearly see the truck sitting just yards from us. The motor goes off, and it was like I blinked and it was gone, maybe even in less than a blink. How can an inanimate object be a ghost? I'm not sure I even believe in ghosts at all, but I saw that truck disappear. And as I type those words, I fully understand how ridiculous and stupid they sound. But it happened, and I don't even believe it. It's a weird place to be in, and Deb is in exactly the same place. I believe in God, so I guess that means I believe in the supernatural since God is supernatural. But I don't believe in disappearing trucks, but I saw one disappear. Can you understand what I'm saying? I don't believe what I saw, but I saw it. It drives me crazy. Pun intended. My mom and I would talk about the afterlife, ghosts, and signs, and how interested we were in the topic. My mom went so far as to tell me what to look for if she passed away. Still looking, Mom. Anyway, I really felt like if I experienced something paranormal or otherworldly in a non-threatening way, I'd be cool with it. I was not. Backstory: my cousin ended himself the year I graduated from undergrad. She had experienced a late-term miscarriage about a year before, never really recovered, and was struggling with her then toddler as well. Upon autopsy, they discovered she was actually pregnant again, although very early on, and we still don't know if she knew before she ended herself. She was the only daughter of my aunt and uncle, and they became very reclusive after the funeral services. They stopped talking to everyone or returning people's calls. They clearly needed space, but my mom, being the person she was, would reach out and make sure they knew we were available if they needed us. One night I went over to have dinner with my mom. It was just my mom and me in the house. My aunt came over unexpectedly to talk to my mom. She was having a rough night. I waited in the adjacent living room while they spoke at the kitchen table. I remember I kept the TV off because I felt like that was disrespectful, and smartphones weren't really a thing yet, so I literally just stared at the fireplace, zoning out. As I was doing that, our porch door, which I was facing, opened. I remember being startled by it because it wasn't typical. The door to the porch was hung when we had hardwood floors, and my parents had put in plush wall-to-wall carpeting, so now we had to use some muscle to get it open due to the resistance. Anyway, I froze, felt all the hair on my neck stand up, and stared at the door. It closed again, super slow. I said out loud, "Do it again," and the door slowly opened, waited a few moments, and closed again. I then thought about my aunt and whether I should bring them in. I debated asking out loud if that was my cousin and or if she wanted me to call attention to it. But the overwhelming feeling of creep had my skin so nerved, I panicked. The door opened again and began to close, and I said out loud, "I thought I could take it, but I can't. I need you to stop," and the door stopped closing and didn't move again. I stared at it for another 45 minutes until my aunt left. The whole time, I felt like me and the door were both having an awkward silence moment. We were both sitting there waiting for our moms. I really wish I was stronger and could have explored it further. Nothing like that ever happened again. And the door still requires a good amount of force to open and close because of the carpet, and it's been 9 years since that happened. This happened when I was around 12 or 13. My mom recently got thrown out by her drunk boyfriend, so she needed to find a place for her and me to live. She found these nice little apartment complexes on the edge of town. We moved in, and everything seemed fine. We moved into the complex during the summer. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom, and we were on the top floor. My mother took the bedroom farthest back in the apartment, which left me with the dinky one across the hall from the bathroom. I noticed right off the bat when I began putting my belongings in my new room, which is colder than the rest of the house. Significantly colder. I was thankful due to the humid weather going on outside. It was my first night sleeping in my room, and I didn't feel right. Something felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be in there. I felt very unwelcome. It was also almost too cold to even sleep. So for the next few weeks, I would sleep on the couch in the living room. Oftentimes, when my mom was at work, I would hear strange sounds coming from the door to my room. Like little scratching sounds or creaks. I didn't think much about it. One day, my mom comes home from work and asks me to get my laundry together. So I go into my room, and I'm stunned by this thick, heavy layer of cold air. I rush, gather my belongings, and shut the door behind me. Whenever my mom leaves to go to the laundry, I sit on the couch and hear a doorknob jiggle. I stood up to investigate, and it was my doorknob. It's just slowly turning back and forth as if whatever is touching the doorknob doesn't want to be noticed. I get goosebumps all over my body and just feel fear. I run back over to the couch and stare in the direction of my room, waiting for it to stop. Another week goes by of me sleeping on the couch, and my mom is fed up. She tells me I need to sleep in my room. No big deal, right? It's not like I've actually seen anything. Except for my doorknob ducking moving for no reason. So that night, I wait until I'm very tired before going into my room to sleep. I lay down, and eventually I drifted off. That's when I felt it. Something was pressing on my feet. Like holding them down, but not with much force. I slowly open my eyes and look around my room, too scared to look at my feet first. When I finally reach my feet, I don't see anything. Until my eyes finally focus. Then I saw her. All I can see is the top of a girl's head from her nose up. She is glaring at me. Her hands pressed against the foot of my bed. Her eyes seemed like a golden brown, and her skin looked gray. Like she was pale but rotten? I can't think of another adjective for that, but she was really disturbing. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid that if I stood up and ran to the living room, she would stand up too. She was closer to the door than I was. I couldn't peel my eyes from her. We sat there staring at each other for what seemed like an eternity before I finally got the ducking balls to grab my pillow and charge for the door. I slammed my door shut behind me and flew to the couch. I instantly felt more serene. That room's vibes are so off-putting. I didn't tell my mom because she is difficult to talk to. I do think she would believe me, but something about the situation made me want to keep it to myself. I don't know why. I didn't sleep in there again. We actually ended up moving out shortly after because her drunk boyfriend wanted her back. That was over 10 years ago, and I can still remember that girl visibly. A desert is a scary place for me now. It used to be a place filled with peace and serenity, but since living out there for almost 30 years, you see things. This occurrence took place in the high desert of California in the early 1990s. The whole town was once all military. There is a military plant there and a prison, and the streets to this day consist of numbers and letters, for example, Avenue O and 178th Street. You have always heard stories of people missing and underground tunnels, confirmed. In fact, a friend of mine kept getting a draft coming from his closet in his childhood home. Later, after he grew up, he checked it out and found an opening to one of these tunnels. He called me over to check it out, but after I got there and we went through the opening, I was too freaked out to go more than 10 feet in when I turned around and told him that this might be how people disappear. You always saw things late at night off in the distance, far past the lights of that small town, strange glowing different colored lights that would move around low or zigzag, then shoot straight up. We saw things in the sky, just stuff you never talked about. Life was pretty carefree back then. If you wanted to visit friends, though, you would have to drive down long desert roads and sometimes end up coming home late at night in the pitch black because there were no street lights. I remember coming home late one night with my boyfriend at the time and another friend, and we pulled over for some reason. Something compelled me to get out of the car and look up at the stars. We were in the middle of nowhere, but we could hear what sounded like machinery and muffled clanks like metal. We all started looking around but didn't see anything. Just then, we felt a vibration under our feet. I crouched down on the street and put my ear to the ground. It was coming from under us. We all listened intently and heard far down voices but couldn't make out what was being said. We stood up and were discussing what it might have been when we saw a small red light on the horizon, and it was getting closer. We piled into the car and got out of Dodge. We only told a few friends, and they experienced the same thing. A year later, I told a friend that I had started a small hauling business. Still, there was a big job, so I needed to borrow a trailer. He said he had a few that I could use, so I should come out to his property to check them out. It was just starting to get dark when he pulled out his new toy, military-grade night vision binoculars. He told me to wait until it got dark to leave because he wanted to show me something creepy, and I was all in. Later, we walked towards the back of his property, looking out at nothing, no lights, no roads, nothing but a barren desert. He He pointed the binoculars east, and ooh my, there were people out there coming out of the ground and moving around. I said, what the hell am I looking at? And he told me that his family called them ground dwellers and that they are located in various parts of the desert. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. Needless to say, I never went to his house after dark again. At one point in my life, I lived in a mobile home park a little past Avenue F. There was a massive treehouse in my yard that was left by the former tenant. The only way to get up into it was through a hole cut in the floor with a door on it, and under that was a rope ladder. One night I was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of tea when I heard something move up in the treehouse, and then a head popped up. It was a lady and her husband hiding. Clearly, I thought they were on drugs. I told them to come down from there, but they both refused. It wasn't until I threatened to call the authorities did they cautiously comply, looking all around, not wanting to be seen. By now, there was a small group of my friends and nosy neighbors gathering around. I saw that she was terrified by something, so I asked them to come in. I made them something to eat and waited for her to calm down. Then the lady reached in her bag and pulled out some papers, and they looked like legal documents with government letterhead. There were drawings and schematics, and some of them even had embossed seals. I couldn't help but notice that they had water and smoke damage, and a few of them were burned on the edges. She told me that they were checking out this place off Barrel Springs Road where there were 2 or 3 cinder block structures. I knew them well. A few years ago, I happened upon that place, and a black truck rushed down to greet me with guns drawn. She said the same thing happened to her, but she was in one of the structures, so she grabbed some things, and she and her husband ran. I went over these pages and felt very uneasy reading them, like this was stuff people get killed over if it gets out. Stupidly, I said, why don't you just simply give them back? She said they had been running, and everywhere they stop, a black car or van with government or no plates shows up with darkened windows, and they just sit there watching them. Well, I really didn't want to get too involved, especially after reading what I did. I thought it was too big for me. I will take what I saw to my death, so I packed them lunch and told them they could sleep in the treehouse for the night. They did, but they were gone early the next morning before I woke up. After that, we started seeing black vans parked on our lonely road facing the house. At one point, I even walked up to one of them, but they took off as soon as I knocked on their blacked out driver's window. Lots of unexplained things happened out there in the desert that you don't see much of now, I think because there are more lights and people, well-lit towns, and camera phones pointing everywhere. There weren't cell phones to call for help back then. I remember one time, a few years later, it was a fun day with some of my friends. We were in this stupid little red car called a Yugo that seemed to be on its last leg most of the time. My friend's uncle told him that there was a whole abandoned town far west of the Mojave Desert, and there were things just left there all over the place. We were so dumb. It took us a long time to get out there, and if you ask me to try and find it now, I don't know if I could. I wasn't driving. After thinking we were lost a few times, we started seeing things. A carnival ticket booth on a trailer, broken tractors and furniture, little shacks here and there, and empty water bottles everywhere. There wasn't a livable house, store, or place of business for many, many miles. I wondered how anyone could even survive in a place like this, and then we saw it. It was long and looked like a single wide mobile home if you could ever call it home. It was between 60 and 50 feet long, and it was raised with the siding going all the way to the ground. It looked like something from a horror movie. It had several windows along the length of the house. Some of the windows had old, frayed curtains still hung up and blowing in the desert breeze. There were open sections of missing siding, exposing the darkness underneath the structure big enough to step on or crawl through. There were dusty cars with their doors and trunks open, trash and open cans all over the place, and a small fire pit in the middle of all of this. His girlfriend and I saw people that seemed to not be wearing any clothes that we could make out, but their bodies were skinny and didn't move like ours. They were inside that house and were watching us from the windows and from the open spaces underneath. They were following us, and as we slowly drove past, they went from window to window and open space to open space underneath. They were almost inhuman and had big eyes and pale skin, too pale for the desert. My friend, the driver, pulled up next to the fire pit, and despite us screaming to go go go, he turned off the car. His girlfriend began to cry out that we had to leave now. He didn't see what we saw. He said, "Stop, babe, this stuff is cool." Oh my gosh, I wanted to punch him in the face. We both kept looking at the people watching us while begging him to get back in the car and drive. He picked up a long bone off the ground and started to push the soot around in the fire pit and said, "Hey, it looks like somebody cooked a dog." Just then, he looked up. His girlfriend leaned over to the driver's seat and grabbed his jacket in an attempt to pull him back in the car when he finally saw what we were seeing and said, OSHT. That thing hiding under the house was swaying back and forth, his hands were on both sides of the opening, and he was staring at us almost with intent to lunge. He tried to start the car, but it failed. Thinking that this was my end and eating in the desert, I began to beat on the back of his seat, screaming, "Please God, start." After 3 tries, it started. We tore out of there, leaving a cloud of dust. We pulled over far from that location and tried to compose ourselves. Never again, never again. We didn't talk about what we saw after that. I think we were in disbelief that it even happened. There were so many crazy things that occurred in the desert back in those days, too many to even come close to telling you. I know that there are things we do not, or maybe will never, understand. I also know that there are more eyes now paying attention, so I don't think it will be too much longer before we all know the truth. Just a tidbit of information. Rosamond way back in the day was a toxic dump site, that's why the houses were so cheap, but if you ask anyone now, they don't have a clue. When I was 6 years old, my family and I lived in a big apartment complex. Outside the front was a big grassy area, and across from that was another apartment complex. I had a group of about 4 little friends around my age there. One day, we went through the glass doors into the other apartment complex. It had a big pool surrounded by apartments. The pool was covered for the season. While we were looking around, a man came up to us. I remember he had dark, almost black hair, kind of thinning, and a black mustache. He asked us kids what we were doing, and we said we were just walking around. He introduced himself and said he was a policeman. We all thought that was pretty neat, because I'm pretty sure he was the first policeman I'd ever met up close. He didn't talk to us any more than that, so we all just left and went to play somewhere else. It's strange when I think about it, but I don't remember ever seeing another person at that apartment complex. But later that night, my friends and I went back over there, for whatever reason, probably bored again. We walked in through the glass doors and up to the covered pool when the same man came over to us again. He asked, "What are you doing over here at night? You kids should be home." I don't remember what we said in response, or if we even had time to respond. What the man said to us next changed my worldview for the next decade or so. He yelled, "Get out of here. I'm the boogeyman." Of course, I had been told all of my life that there's no such thing as the boogeyman, plus I felt safe with that man because he had said he was a policeman, and policemen were invariably good guys. So I said, "No, you're not. You told us you were a policeman." He was clearly angry or crazy and obviously wanted to scare us, so I think the fact that we'd hesitated aggravated him. He responded, "During the day, I'm a policeman, but at night, I'm the boogeyman." And as he said it, to prove that he meant it, he picked up one of my friends and threw him in the covered pool. That was enough to convince us. The rest of us ran out the doors and to our own apartments as fast as our little legs would go. We were too young to even consider going back to help our friend, who I saw was struggling to get out of and off of the pool. So we didn't know until the next day if he had escaped the boogeyman. But every one of us kids told our parents that the boogeyman was indeed real and that we had met him. In fact, I told a lot of people over the next several years that the boogeyman was real. I used the fact that he had picked up my friend and thrown him as proof. And for the rest of my childhood, I actually believed the boogeyman wasn't an actual human but a monster in human form. That man became a legend in my mind, which I still remember to this day, 50 years later. The first event happened about 2 months after the quarantine started last year, so it was about the beginning of May. Our previous landlord forced us out of our house, which, in fairness, is theirs, but is totally inconvenient and annoying to say the least, especially during the quarantine. They did it so that their family could move into it, but that's beside the point. My parents had purchased their first house, and my brother and I were staying our second or third night there, I can't remember which. We'd started sleeping there the night before our parents, and they had started sleeping there as well. That's about all I can remember. There are a couple things about my room that you should know about before I go on, so that this makes sense. My closet is placed directly beneath the stairs. This means I can hear whenever someone is going up or down the stairs. The door to my closet swings open and closed, but the knob is like a notch that's really hard to twist so that it can open, and it's only accessible from the outside. Anyone opening it would make noise, even if it happened smoothly. My bedroom door at the time didn't fit the door frame correctly. The only way it would stay closed is if you leaned a heavy weight against it, so for months until it was fixed, I had a 12-pound dumbbell that I would lean against to keep it closed. There was also a deadbolt on the inside that you could only latch and unlatch from the inside. This was probably the previous owner's method of dealing with the door. My brother's room is a few feet down the hall on the other side, and the door slides open loudly. Lastly, My dad had told my brother and I earlier that day to make sure the basement light was off before going to bed, so hours before this started, I had turned it off. Anyway, it's about midnight or close to it. I had been playing video games and was a little tired, so I decided to go to bed, but this is where things start getting weird. At one point, a small light catches my eye. It's coming from the crack underneath my door, but it's not like it should be. If it was the basement light, wouldn't the light be yellowish? It was stark white, and it looked more like someone was shining a flashlight underneath the door, and it illuminated a circular area in front of it, but it was as if the person holding it was standing at a 45-degree angle from the door, when the only way that this was possible is if someone was flashing a light underneath it. But even that would cast light on the other side of the room. And I would have heard someone coming downstairs to do this, or my brother coming out of his room. And if this was an elaborate prank, why would they do it like this instead of making weird noises outside the walls? It struck me as odd, but not enough to investigate or really worry about it. Yeah, stupid. I know. It didn't bite me in the back later, so I went to bed, closing my closet door. But the next morning, my closet door was wide open. This shouldn't even be possible. I have no history of sleepwalking before or since, so that explanation doesn't make sense. I had deadbolted the door shut, so in case there was an intruder with that light, they couldn't get in my room. So how could my closet door have been opened? My door was still deadbolted, so no one could have entered or left the room. The light phenomenon only occurred once more, a couple months later, and I thought maybe I imagined it at the time. But then the worst happened, and it confirmed that it was real. It was a few nights before my first week of college, and I was drifting awake because I thought I might have heard something. I'm not a very heavy sleeper. But then, something scares me to full consciousness. I hear the doorknob of my door turn as if someone is opening it, and then turn as if someone is releasing it. Bear in mind that my door had been fixed a few months ago, but the deadbolt was still there. I thought someone had entered my room. My eyes hadn't opened, and I hadn't changed sleeping positions, so I wasn't going to give myself away to a potential intruder. I wasn't sure if I had deadbolted my door anyway. Then, a footstep into my room causes my stomach to sink. My room is about 15 feet long, and I could tell this footstep had come from next to the door. My bed is on the far corner from it. The next footstep lands a few feet from my side. This makes my stomach sink further because something or someone had to have crossed at least 10 feet in one stride. I can hear other noises from other parts of the house, so I can tell there's more of whoever or whatever this is. While I'm playing asleep, a few things cross my mind. I considered whether it was my brother, but like before, I thought, why would he go through this much trouble of staying up late, just to have the off chance that I'm awake at this hour? Then, I considered that maybe he was getting something before remembering that I have nothing that he wants. Maybe it's one of my parents? But again, why would they go through this kind of trouble since they both have work in the morning? So there's no way it's anyone I know. For about 5 minutes, nothing else happens in my room, but the noises outside persist. I decide maybe it's safe to wake up, and I look around my room, which is slightly illuminated by the automatically paused television. I had fallen asleep watching Futurama. I can see in the darkness that my door is deadbolted, so I was safe the whole time, but it only raised further questions. How could there have been any footsteps in my room, no matter how much distance they crossed? My brother's cat couldn't have been doing this since cats can't turn doorknobs without struggling, and whatever had messed with mine had turned it with ease and only made noise with my door using that. Maybe some of the noises were from the cat, but it sounded more like maybe someone was reorganizing stuff in the basement. After I had quickly examined the room, I checked the time, and I could see that it was 3:50 a.m. Anyone who's dabbled with the paranormal, or at least seen enough content, can tell you that 3 a.m. is what some people call the witching hour or devil's hour, and this was happening during that time, so take from that what you will. For another 5 minutes, these sounds persisted. It ended with what sounded like someone putting a bottle of bleach into a cabinet, and then silence. About half an hour later, I heard someone open the side door, close and lock it, go downstairs into my brother's room, and silence again. That last bit was my brother. The next day, I discovered that he'd been staying the night at a friend's house and just decided to cut and come home early, and he arrived around the time I heard him come home. But it happened half an hour after whatever had explored our house finished up. I don't know what it was, other than that, whatever it was couldn't be human.